Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait 1 or 2 minutes for some stragglers to come, and then we'll get started. All right, it looks like the flow of people joining us slowed down a bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Grenling. Not sure what's happening to the slides. There we go. Happy to welcome you to the R21 R01 grant writing workshop that is put on by the Georgia CTSA and the School of Medicine at Emory. So again, my name is Kathy Grenling. I'm pleased to be your host today. We've put together, I think, a really outstanding panel of investigators who have experience in diverse types of R01 and R21 applications that span from basic science to clinical research to all the way to implementation science. So what we're going to do first is take a minute to introduce ourselves, tell you about our areas of expertise, which will help you direct your questions as we go through the day. So I'll start. I'm a professor of medicine at Emory. I'm a vascular biologist, so a basic scientist. So I've been funded by the NIH for 35 years. I've served on numerous NIH study sections for many different types of proposals. So I will represent the basic science aspects of grant submission. Lillian, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I'm Lillian Eby. I'm a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia. I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and the type of work I do would fall within the dissemination and implementation science area, and have been on lots of study sections, both standing sections as well as special sections in health services and organizational delivery.
Thanks, Lillian. Stacy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacy Heilman, Associate Professor and Associate Vice Chair for Research in Pediatrics. I'm a neuroscientist by training, a basic scientist, but now I'm more of a research generalist, and I have a lot of experience with career development and really understanding what it takes to launch a research career, and have lots of sort of generalist strategies that I've gleaned from the dozens of applications that I've been involved in that I'm happy to share with you.
Thank you. Colleen?
Hi, everyone. My name is Colleen Kelly. I'm in the Division of Adult Infectious Diseases at Emory. My research kind of runs the gamut from some translational immunology to clinical trials, and also some public health kind of epidemiologic type research, all surrounding sexual health, HIV and STI prevention, for the most part in marginalized populations.
Thanks, Colleen. Justin?
Hi, everybody. I'm Justin Labner. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Georgia. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I do both observational as well as intervention studies with couples and families from marginalized populations to promote individual and relational well-being.
Thank you. Greg?
Hi, I'm Greg Lisinski. I'm a professor and vice chair in the Department of Hematology and Medical Oncology at Emory University. At the Winship Cancer Institute, I'm the Associate Director for Basic Research and Shared Resources. I've had a NIH-funded laboratory for over 20 years, focused on cancer immunology at the interface between basic science and clinical trials. I've reviewed extensively for the NIH and other grant review systems.
Thanks, Greg. And Andy, last but not least.
Good afternoon. I'm Andy Shane. I'm the Division Chief of Pediatric Infectious Diseases at Emory and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. I'm primarily a clinical researcher involved in a number of multi-site studies, as well as studies with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and some NIH-funded studies. I also just wanted to make a quick plug for the MSCR program, which is run through the Georgia CTSA if you're interested in pursuing some additional training in clinical research. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Next slide, please. We just want to set some ground rules for our time together today. So first of all, make sure you keep yourself muted using the icon button at the bottom left of your screen. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. So in addition to the speaker, one or more of us will be monitoring the chat, answering questions in the chat, or maybe bringing them out for the whole group to discuss. We do have some pauses for discussion time, and during the discussion, if you just type the word question in the chat box, we'll call on you to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. If your display right now is showing anything other than your name, there are 3 little dots on the right-hand side of your picture. If you choose those dots, you can rename yourself. That way we know who we're speaking with, and that would be much appreciated. So just to flex those muscles in your fingers, if you would right now, enter in the chat what you would most like to learn from today's session. That will help us gear things properly. Nobody wants to learn anything. There we go. Tips and tricks. We actually have a slide entitled Tips for a Successful Grant Application. Matching research interest to the grant. We're going to talk about that. Strategies for competitive application. We have another slide, I think, actually named that. Writing clearly and concisely, yes. Most common mistakes, yes. Tailoring specific aims, yes. Ideal timeline, that one will be a point of discussion, I'm sure. Best practices engaging foreign partners. We may have to come back to that question. And tailoring to specific institutes, yes. Do's and don'ts. So yes, lots of great questions, and we will do our best to address them as we go along. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speakers, who are Andy and Colleen. I'll let you take over.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy, and good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to have this opportunity. Colleen and I are going to tag team this first section. If we could have the next slide, please.
Dr. Shane, you should be able to control the PowerPoint.
Okay. Do we have to just click on the slide? No.
Click once on the slide, and then you should be able to move forward with arrows. There you go.
Okay, I seem to be muted. Okay, let me go back one. Sorry. Okay, hang on. I'm just trying to get back to. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So these are the topics that we would like to review today. And we're going to start out with before you submit. And so we did our introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about this, really teasing out what is the goal of your grant? What do you want to accomplish with the grant? What are you trying to investigate? What are you trying to understand? And then a question that I saw in the chat too, which is the best mechanism in R01 versus an R21 versus others. Although this session is really focusing on R21 versus R01, there are other mechanisms as well. How to shop the idea, figuring out if you're ready to submit, selecting an institute in a study section if you're focusing on NIH, communicating with program officers, building a team and choosing collaborators, somebody had asked about partnering with international partners. Many of us have had some experience with that too, and we can certainly happy to address that. There are some unique aspects to conducting research in global settings. Timeline and project management, really a crucial point. And then we'll talk about some additional criteria for clinical trials and some common pitfalls, which I think other people had asked about as well. So starting out with what is the goal of your grant? So this really is sort of stepping back, thinking about yourself, thinking about your career, thinking about where you want to be and what you hope to accomplish with this particular grant. A lot of times we're inspired by the work that we're doing. And so that is one inspiration. Thinking about reading and thinking. So a lot of our inspirational ideas come at times that we may or may not be actually focusing on research. But that's an opportunity to think about where you are. The other place or opportunity is at meetings or other conferences. Oftentimes you're inspired by other people whom you interact with. And then what is the novel, relevant question that you wish to answer? So you may have a great idea, but how can you focus that and hone it down on a particular question or set of questions that then can be developed into specific aims, which Stacey Heilman will talk about afterwards. It's a good idea to understand what other research is ongoing, and a very good source, especially if you're interested in pursuing clinical trials, is clinicaltrials.gov. And so that's a listing of trials that are being done both within the United States and internationally related to clinical research. Looking through PubMed and other databases, there's also NIH puts together a report, which is expanded database that contains entries from all different types of trials, so not just clinical trials, basic science, translational, everything that is being sponsored by NIH. So it's a great way of sort of figuring out what has been done in that particular area. And then all that background research that we call it really helps you think about, can I take this and what is my new or novel approach? A lot of times we do things in medicine or science, or there's a belief that's been passed down through generations, but really hasn't been evaluated. So is this an opportunity to challenge a paradigm? And then we'd also encourage you to really dream big and have a vision for what you want to pursue. And I'll stop here and ask Colleen if she'd like to add anything else to this.
Yeah, I think just to the first point of read and think is, I just can't overstate the importance of, going down that rabbit hole in the literature and reading that, older primary paper, and then the references from there, and then the references from there. Because they really start to, as you do that, you start to generate those questions that, you realize where the holes are and where, you could potentially fill in something with your proposal that either hasn't been done before or really changes the approach to what in the ways that other people have addressed a similar health problem before. I think this also will come up in our next slides, but really thinking and knowing very clearly what the health impact of your work has is going to be very important. Even if it's the most mechanistic of basic science, it has to be very clear to reviewers and to the NIH and institutes how this knowledge is going to advance health. Even if it's, 20, 30 years down the road when an intervention is eventually developed. But it just, we're not in the business of generating knowledge for the purpose of generating knowledge, but actually to improving overall health. So that's where I would add to that.
Great, thank you. And then the next step is thinking about the best funding mechanism. And so while this presentation focuses a little bit on NIH, R21, and R01s, it's also important to remember that other federal entities such as AHRQ, CDC, FDA, and foundation awards may be good opportunities to pursue different areas and different research questions. And so depending on if your work is more focused on epidemiology, perhaps CDC may have an opportunity, HRQ, thinking about health resources and health quality. FDA also has some funding if you're developing a device or thinking about a new use of a drug. Those may be potential other funding mechanisms in addition to NIH. Also, don't forget about foundation awards. There are many out there, and especially if your topic area relates to something that a foundation is interested in, that also may be a good opportunity for pursuing funding. So just as a little bit of background, we sort of think about R01 as the original and the oldest grant mechanism that's used by the NIH. And there are two different types. There's both the investigator-initiated, and then there's the ones that are asked for through a request for applications, or what's commonly referred to as an RFA. The R01 research plan, if it's proposed by the applicant, really has to be related to the stated program interests of one of more of the NIH institutes and centers. And this is really a great opportunity to really get involved and understand what the different NIH centers may be focusing on, what their areas of interest might be. Oftentimes, there may be the opportunity for centers combine to issue a request for applications that may cross a number of different centers. So if your area of research relates to that, then you may have an opportunity perhaps to obtain funding through a center that you may not have traditionally thought about, but may offer you some additional opportunities. Oftentimes in pediatrics, we think about NICHD, which is the institute that's very involved with child health funding. But in infectious diseases, we think about NIAID. And so sometimes there are opportunities that are funded by both institutes, or you may have thought about funding through one institute, but perhaps another institute would be interested in your idea as well. And then, as I mentioned, the report, the research portfolio online reporting tools can also provide you with some great information about grants that have been funded by a particular center. And I just, on the slide, we show a screenshot from the report to help you potentially find some different funding mechanisms, and you can sort by center, you can sort by year, you can even see what other people at your own institution have been doing. It's a great way to meet research friends, and so that's really a very helpful mechanism. Colleen, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I would was just only going to add that, while the coveted R grant is kind of the exemplar of success in an academic research career, if you haven't heard, they can be a little hard to come by. And, we should be looking at various funding sources. And sometimes you can shop around the same idea and pieces of the same proposal at the same time to various funders. And really, that's the secret to success. I don't think there's a successful academic researcher that hasn't kind of diversified their funding portfolio outside of just, the NIH R grant. It's just not possible these days to maintain your program solely on kind of NIH R level funding. And so I think there's, lots of Googling that can be done, the emails that come out from our institutions about new funding announcements. Really think about how your project or pieces of your project or an offshoot of your project might apply to some of the other agencies and foundations.
Great, thank you. So shopping the idea. So this is when you sort of take all those thoughts that are going around in your brain that you're coming to you when you're taking a shower or exercising or not thinking about perhaps your research, and really trying to focus and hone them in on what you want to pursue. And so this is taking the brainstorming and making it a little more focused. And so Stacy will talk at length about how to draft aims, but when you're thinking broadly about this, you want to think about the significance. Is what you're proposing to do innovative? Is it feasible, which is also extremely important? And will, as Colleen mentioned previously, will it really have a clear health impact? And so oftentimes you'll be starting with a big idea and maybe a little bit of data, and how you can take that and then move that through sort of a process to come up with ultimately your specific aims. So some thoughts about how this process works, and I guess it's kind of a little bit like making sausage, but really discussing and sharing with everyone. And so, you know, we all love to talk about ideas and speaking to people both within your field and then also very importantly outside your field, because some of the people who may be evaluating your grant may not be in your field and may not have the exact understanding or the detailed understanding of what you're planning. So it's good to have some input from people both in and without your field. As you're doing this, thinking about people who could be collaborators is another great way of helping to sort of build your team as well. Also being very critical of your own ideas, thinking about are there flaws? What would somebody do to maybe say that this is not a good idea, or what can you do to strengthen the idea? Better to have sort of the holes poked while you're coming up with the idea and developing the plan rather than after you've submitted. This is a great opportunity to meet with or discuss with potential program officers. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a subsequent slide, but those are individuals who can help you hone ideas or at least help you think about where the best place is for your potential submission. And always good to think big, but make sure you can afford it. And while we don't want finances to be the overall driver, it is important to try to be realistic. Colleen, other comments?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the questions posted just early when Kathy asked for questions was, you know, how do you decide which mechanism, R01, R21? You know, and a lot comes down to what you might be ready for. You know, do you have the scientific credibility and background and track record to justify an R01? Or is something like an R21 maybe more suitable for you? But those also have very different budgets and very different timelines, and you certainly cannot afford the same type of project, an R01 idea on an R21 budget. That's just not possible. And so I think we all can come up with ways to solve all the problems of the world with unlimited resources, but what you're trying to do is fit your idea in your project into a predefined budget, and that can be very difficult to do. And so pretty early on, I do start thinking about, well, how much would it actually cost me to do this study that I'm thinking of? And what kind of mechanism would it really fit into from a budget perspective? Because you'll soon find out that it's probably more than what they'll give you, and you need to figure a way to trim things down and still make it something that's significant, innovative, feasible, and with clear health impact, which can be challenging.
Great, thank you. And this leads right into the question about, are you ready? I guess another way of asking this is, when are you ready? But really thinking about, as you've developed your idea, feedback on the science and the team, important, as Colleen mentioned, when you're thinking about which mechanism, can you make a case for your expertise? Are you ready for an R01, or should you think about an R21 or some other mechanism? And that depends a little bit on where you are in your career and how much you've developed the idea. Do you have sufficient preliminary data? And that also, once again, depends on the mechanism. For an R01, yes, needed, but maybe not for an R21, and perhaps maybe not for a foundation grant or another mechanism that may be more of an opportunity to obtain additional data. And then thinking about, is your rationale believable and well composed? And hopefully you've received a lot of feedback from your collaborators and colleagues to help you get to this point. I think also thinking about your career trajectory and where you are, and oftentimes this grant is not the only thing that you're pursuing. And so how does this sort of fit into the puzzle of your ultimate career trajectory will also help you think about the times to submit. And of course, NIH has standard deadlines, and so you can see those online and then sort of try to plan your timeline based on some of those deadlines, if that is the deadline that you'll be, that's a mechanism that you'll be pursuing. A lot of foundation grants actually often are more flexible and don't have specified guidelines, specified deadlines. So you may have more flexibility there. Colleen?
Yeah, someone just mentioned, might just follow up a little bit on the R21 versus R01 with respect to budget. You have to look at the RFA, at the program announcement, and see what the actual budget is. But in general, an R21 is usually a 2-year award with a maximum total budget of usually around $250,000 spread over those 2 years. R01s are longer awards. They tend to be, 3 to 5 years, usually in the 4 to 5 year range. And they also are on an annual budget basis, usually somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 per year. So it's quite a big difference in the scope of the project. And when we talk about, are you ready for an R01? I mean, I think people are anticipating that the lead PI of an R01 is going to be reasonably well known in their area of interest. They're going to have some publications. They may not be a senior faculty level. I mean, they may be someone who's in early career stage, but they're going to have some credibility behind their kind of scientific skills and expertise, usually based on publications, prior funding, that sort of thing. So that's what I would add to that. I see a question from Nanda. Hi, Nanda, in the chat about investigator-initiated mechanisms, and that is it allowed to submit multiple grants for the same mechanism or multiple mechanisms in the same cycle. You can submit multiple mechanisms in the same cycle, like an R01 and an R21. I think you do need to be careful about this if they're going to the same study section. When I sit on study section, I would say that those probably tend not to get reviewed as well when the same PI has multiple grants in the same study section. So I do, but it is possible to do it. It's certainly allowable. But you might want to consider whether there's a way to get things into different study sections at the same time. And then multiple grants for the same mechanism. Same thing. I mean, I think when I'm sat on study section, I've certainly seen this, like submitting 2 R01s to the same deadline that go to the same study section. I don't think they do as well. I mean, the amount of effort you should be putting into having the best product you possibly can when you submit an R01, in my opinion, is not really conducive to doing 2 at the same time. And I think reviewers kind of think that too, but others should maybe comment if that's their experience as well.
I was just writing an answer to that. I'm going to jump in and just say, I think when people try to do 2 grants for the same deadline, they don't do as good a job on each individual grant. And because these grants are so competitive, you're much better off making sure you have 1 grant that's really as perfect as you can make it, rather than 2 grants that are not quite there yet. That would be my advice.
Totally agree. I mean, you're really striving for as close to perfection as you can get with that, with that grant. And I think it's really hard to do that twice at the same time.
Colleen, could you comment on the question about resubmission and new proposal at the same time? From Zeke.
Oh, yeah. Again, you certainly can do it. But I think that it would be viewed a little less favorably if it was being reviewed by the same study section, just for, I think, the exact same reasons. Yeah, so resubmission may be a little bit less work if you're just tweaking a few things here and there. But you really want people to concentrate on this one product that you have in front of them. I don't think you want to distract them with multiple applications in the same study section, but that would be my approach for sure.
Thanks. And there was also just, I think Lillian responded about shopping around. There was a question about that in the chat too. And, I think sometimes people are concerned that discussing ideas on a larger scale might result in someone scooping your idea. And so I guess it just really depends on your field. In Peds ID, we're all really friendly. And I think in most other fields that is true as well. But knowing your field a little bit, I will say that national meetings are actually a great opportunity to get people together who may have combined and similar interests, and having little discussion groups, maybe with adult beverages, sometimes helps to have the flow of ideas come through as well. So I would say in general, try to spread your ideas. It's a great way to get feedback as well. Okay. This is, we talked a little bit, but we can go over some of these. Are your research ideas crystallized? Do or will you have the resources to execute? Can you justify the health impact? And then, as we sort of talked about, what is the long-term plan beyond the R21 and R01, and how does it fit into a larger plan for advancing the science? So these are a little more sort of operational ideas about whether you feel like you're ready for that particular mechanism. Do others have comments?
Anyone who has a comment or a question, if you'd like to write the word question in chat, then we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself for these slides.
I would just add one thing about resources. This is Lillian, and that is particularly as a junior investigator, one of the really important resources that I think people sometimes underestimate is the team, particularly if you're applying for an R01. Because you will have to demonstrate that you're ready for this, and also that your collaborators on your team ideally are people that you've actually collaborated with. And so it doesn't look like window dressing of putting on a real senior person who you may have no experience working with. So conference papers, working papers, other projects that you might be doing with more senior people, if you don't have an R01 and you're going for an R01, are really important. And also making sure you have the appropriate methodological expertise on the team. The one thing that most of us speak that's common is methodology. And so I have found in study sections that making sure you have what often gets questioned is something around the method, right? The approach. And so making sure you have the appropriate expertise on the team methodologically, if your own CV doesn't demonstrate that you have that expertise, is really, really important, particularly in my area.
Great,
thanks, Lillian.
And Andy, there's one more question that about the same question about resubmission and new submission in the same study section. So maybe you want to give your perspective on that.
Yes, I think it just sort of depends on the study section, and I think probably if you mean submitting them at the same time, that probably would not be ideal. But if this was a resubmission and a new submission in different study sections, that certainly may be optimal. I guess it really depends on, I would say this is really an opportunity to talk to the program officer, because they really can, they are your BFF, and they can really help you with some of the behind the scenes strategies for how to do this. So I guess it just would depend on the circumstance, but I would talk to the program officer.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. They're going to know their study section, and they're going to know, when this has happened, in the past, how the study section reviewed it. I personally would be very cautious. I don't think it's a great idea to have two grants in the same review meeting. It's just so hard to get fundable scores. It really needs to be just an excellent, outstanding application to get a fundable score. And I think chances are that both applications wouldn't be viewed that way, and less likely to get one that way.
Okay, great. Thanks. Then thinking a little bit about selecting an institute in the study section. So the NIH reporter can really help you with that. You can also look and see the scientific review groups that's located in the project information section to see where other similar grants or applications may have been reviewed. This is an opportunity to also, once again, discuss with your program officer who can guide you about some strategies about where to apply. And then there's a matchmaker function or a text search that can also help you if you put in the topic. That can also, some of the institutes put in areas that they're interested in funding. And so they call that the matchmaker function. Then the Center for Scientific Review also has the assisted referral tool, which can match an abstract to specific aims to a specific study section or scientific review group. And then the other thing that you could do is also look at the rosters of who serves on each one of the study sections, and oftentimes you'll be able to identify people that you may know in the field or may be experts in the field, and if that's something related to your subject area, then that may be a study section that you might want to request. And so you do that through the assignment request form in your application. And so you can suggest an assignment to an institute. It doesn't always mean that you will get assigned there or your grant will get assigned there, but you can certainly ask for it. And that's really the best way potentially of having your grant go to the place that you think may be optimal for review. And then also, I'll just say, don't underestimate the advice of senior colleagues who have either served on scientific review panels or submitted similar studies or studies to the sections that you're interested in. They can also give you some background information.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really great advice. You know, we're so lucky to be in such rich academic environments where lots of people are serving on these study sections in your field. And I think getting their experience about how applications like yours might have been reviewed or pitfalls that they might watch out for is really important. I'll say that overall, I don't stress a lot, maybe a little bit, but I don't stress a lot on worrying about, you know, which study section might my application go to. With the exception, I can say one of these tricks, hopefully that maybe people can take home from this, that I did when I was an early stage investigator, where for whatever reason, we felt like the application I was submitting just wasn't getting a fair shake in the study section. And so we actually did exactly what you just said, Andy, and looked at the roster and figured out that one of the people on the roster was actually very close to me and could become a co-investigator on my application. And once that co-investigator joined my application, then got kicked out to a special emphasis panel. So it was a very strategic move to kind of get out of a study section where I was getting what we thought, maybe accurately or not accurately, not the fairest of reviews, which occasionally can happen. That was one of the kind of maneuvers and strategies that we used.
Great. So we'll just do a little bit of discussion. I alluded to this a little bit and we've talked a lot about it, but program officers are assigned to almost all of the NIH institutes, and their function is to provide administrative and technical assistance as you prepare your grants. Many program officers actually were former, or I guess they are, but are scientists or have submitted grants and been actively involved in research. So in addition to helping you with some of the administrative aspects of grant submission and helping to steer your grant and you through the process, they have some scientific background, which can also be very beneficial as you think about this, because there is sometimes quite a bit of strategy to thinking about this. They also are serving as a liaison between you and the NIH. And they also, their job is really to have NIH or whatever the entity is, because other entities have program offices as well, to have the best applications and the most competitive applications. So if you are submitting your grant to a institute that may not have an interest, they will help you, steer you to another institute, and the same with the study section, and can provide you with some guidance on that. And also they may be willing to provide you some insight onto what funding priorities are. There was a question or note in the chat about funding priorities shifting or changing. Sometimes if they're aware that that can happen, they could give you a heads up about that, and that could help you maybe structure your grant a little bit more to those priorities. Other comments? Okay, cool.
We just need to move on a little
Yeah,
bit.
okay.
We're so
Okay.
far behind.
Okay, just a few more on program officer is your best friend. It's good to have them review a copy of your specific aims, and people often ask, how do I do this? Oftentimes emails probably the best way, and a short summary of your research and specific aims, and then really being specific about what you're asking them to do. And maybe it is just a further discussion to see if the grant potentially would meet the priorities of the institute, and or maybe just an opportunity to have discussions. And so I'd say really take advantage of their advice and expertise. Okay, I'll turn it over to, go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to answer a couple of questions in the chat. So the way I usually approach this or advise it is to meet with the program officer a couple of months before the deadline. You find out who the program officer is at the bottom of your request for applications. You go all the way to the bottom, and it tells you who to contact, and that's who you contact. And I advise people, at least a couple of months before the due date, you should send them a mostly polished draft of your specific aims, and attach that to the email and say that you would specifically like to talk about this application for the upcoming deadline. And usually they're, in my experience, have been more than happy to talk a lot about your project, about the science in the field. And the other important thing about program officers is they attend the study section meetings, so they can tell you how projects similar to yours have potentially done in study section, and what the current makeup of the study section is like, and what types of projects they're liking or not liking now. And so it can be a great resource. Not sure if there's other questions that we missed, but maybe others can chime in. And we need to speed up just a little so we don't get too behind. So I'm going to talk just a few minutes about building a team and choosing your collaborators. So, in general, the expectation now is, that applications have a team of complementary experts, right? So there's generally, either one PI or a lead multi-PI team of 2 or 3 people that's leading the science. But with the scope of something like an R01 application, I think it's accepted that the PIs are not going to have full expertise for every aspect of the project. And so you should be collaborating with other scientists that fill a niche. And that may be someone who has specific laboratory techniques, if they have specific analysis techniques. I think in clinical and translational research, there has to be a statistician on your team, and it will just be totally dumped on it if that person is not there and playing a prominent role on your team. So those are some examples of some of the collaborators. Collaborators are generally co-investigators. You can also have consultants, which are people that provide kind of a one-time or a limited service, but maybe don't meet the engagement of a co-investigator. And that might be someone who's doing a simple data analysis, or who's doing artistic design, or who is providing something like a secondary specimen analysis from some specimens that might be in a freezer, or providing a reagent, or a viral stock, or something like that. That might be something who's more suitable to a consultant. And also on the side, we have regulatory assistance as well listed. Next slide, Andy, I think is also about building the team. Oh, no.
Oh.
So Andy, did you have any other comments about the?
I was just going to say, don't underestimate the value of your statistician and involving them early when you're just thinking about specific aims. It's really key. So I'd say your statistician is your other BFF.
Yeah. And the question, what's the difference between a co-I and a collaborator? I kind of consider them to be the same. I mean, I think it's just maybe a little bit of the language people tend to use, but when I think about a collaborator, I mean, a co-I should be providing significant scientific input into your project, and that usually comes with some effort, some yearly percentage effort in the grant. Someone who's a collaborator, I guess, could be maybe a consultant in some levels, which isn't necessarily providing paid effort on an annual basis on your grant. So timeline and project management, this is really, really important, and probably the most important factor in actually getting the darn thing submitted. It takes a long time, and especially if you're new to grant writing and grant preparation, you really should be thinking a year in advance to submitting a first R01 or even a first R21. It seems like a long time, but it will pass very quickly. Everyone needs to know around you that you're working towards this this goal that is really kind of the primary focus of your time at this point in time. I would say, once you have your due date in mind, then you're going to kind of work backwards on the calendar and make a plan, a pathway for how you're going to achieve, the different components of your application. And we'll talk a little bit about this. Avoiding calendar creep, which, I honestly wish I could follow my own advice right now, but I think there was definitely a time in my life where I was able to really hold myself better to, to deadlines and things of the sort. It's really important during the time period when you're writing that first R01 and R21. And I'm not sure if others have comments on that.
Yeah, I'll just also add, I think it's really important to tell everyone around you that you're submitting a grant. That means both your professional colleagues and your personal people you live with. And so that you can really sort of have that focus when needed, and they can understand if you don't seem to be focused on other aspects. And then, of course, just as a wellness aspect, once the grant is in, then make up that time with those who you have taken it away from to focus on the grant.
I do have to say that might only work for the first or second grant, though, because I do have to say one of my close colleagues once told me that when they told their spouse they were submitting a grant, the spouse rolled their eyes and said, "You're always submitting a grant." So, but for the first or second one, you do need to, you do need to know, everyone around you know that you're working toward this very important goal. I think that's true. So. Next slide. So I think the best piece of advice that, I can give, and that I give to myself and I give to, my mentees and trainees, is to set achievable chunk deadlines. So break what your application is up into pieces, right? And set yourself deadlines that are achievable for each of those pieces. And sometimes this is how I even break through writer's block. So say, I'm going to write my innovation by, October the 30th, my innovation section is going to be done. Sometimes if I know I'm having a really hard time, tackling that, I break it into even smaller pieces where I say, I'm just going to write one paragraph by the end of 2 days from now. And so I know that I can achieve that goal. It's reasonable for me to get there. And it allows me to hold myself to those dates. And so to me, I think that's the best piece of advice that I can give. The science is paramount. If it's bad science, it's hopeless. But the problem is there's also a lot of other components of a grant application that while the review committee may not dwell in them, the NIH certainly does. And if they're not there or they're inappropriately completed, they will kick your grant right back out. So you have to be aware of that. And you have to know that those things are also on track to be submitted at the same time as your fantastic science. And I think that's a little frustrating for people who are early in their career because, you know, the science is so important and so hard to get together. But just be aware of that. And then you certainly need a time cushion. Your timeline, unfortunately, is not everyone else's timeline. It would be nice if that's how the world worked, but it doesn't. And so you're going to need extra time for your co-investigator to give you that paragraph on methods that you're expecting, or for someone to sign that letter of support that you've generated for them. Those things tend to be what I find we're waiting on at the last minute and trying to piece together. Begin with the end in mind. And so I think knowing that what the goal is and what the project is, and then what steps that you need to take to get there. Andy, did you have any other comments about this?
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I think just also making sure that if you're in an academic setting, you cushion in time for research administration review and discussion about budget and other things as well. And don't underestimate, if you have human subjects, the importance of the human subjects section in the applications.
So the NIH reviews grants based on a 1 to 9 scale, where 1 is the best and 9 is the worst. Applications that are really, really excellent and are going to be considered for funding likely score in the 1, 2 to 3 range at the lowest. And so how those scores are generated is there's an overall impact score that the reviewer gives, and that again is a 1 through 9. But the reviewers also give subscores in the areas of significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And in general, you know, there can be some variation. The overall impact score might be a 1, but you may see some 2s, 3s, and 4s in the other categories, and vice versa. You may see some 1s for a few of the subcategories, but your overall impact score may be a 4 or 5. And so there is some variation around that. And what really matters is that overall impact score of 1 to 9. I think significance, you know, what reviewers are looking for is, again, that health impact. Like, what information is your proposal going to add to our field to advance health? The investigative team obviously needs to be experienced and also have appropriate expertise to conduct the study. NIH is very, very puts a lot of weight in innovation. Is this new? Is this a new approach? Is it a novel idea? Does it change the way we've thought about things previously? And does it paradigm shift, as Andy said before? I feel like the approach tends to be where people fall kind of in their scores the most, because I think that's where reviewers tend to get a little more picky. I think we can sometimes see very strong scores in significance and innovation in the investigators, and then the approach is where the score tends to drop, in my experience. And that's because there's always different ways to tackle a problem or to propose a study. And of course, we don't have infinite resources. And so sometimes you just can't afford to do what would be the ideal way to answer your question. And then finally, environment. I think when you're coming from the institutions that we're all coming from, the environment is very strong scientifically, and people tend to get very good scores there. Do others have comments?
I was just going to add, Colleen, that, you know, especially for the environment part, there's a lot of put together statements and summaries of all the various institutions. And so I would say rely on that a lot, because oftentimes you may not know exactly the true scope of the environment. And as you mentioned, most of our grants that are submitted get very high scores on environment because of where we're coming from. But try to leverage the work that other people have done already to incorporate that into your grant.
Yeah, and
So-
Emory School of Medicine, and I'm sure the other institutions are as well, is providing boilerplate language about some of the resources that are available that should go into your grant applications. It's very important to don't overlook the environment, certainly, but I think there's also a lot of goodwill towards the institutions that we're coming from at the NIH. Just very quickly, don't forget for clinical trials and human subjects research, there are of course additional requirements and attachments that you need to be preparing, and those tend to be around enrollment, equity and inclusion, as well as human subjects protections. And so we won't dwell on this too much, but just to be aware that that adds another layer. Similarly, animal projects will have some additional requirements for the applications that need to be addressed. And to be aware of those. So common pitfalls, unexpected things will happen. Things will take longer than you expect. Something won't work out that you thought was going to work out. And so you need to be able to recognize when those things are happening and work through the challenges. Don't make things overly complicated. You are your own worst critique or critic. And so you know all the various pitfalls and things that are wrong with what you're proposing. It's kind of like, you know, writing a manuscript, same with writing the grant. If you don't hate it by the time you submit it, you haven't worked hard enough on it. You know, you haven't thought enough about it. But remember, you've got to simplify it to a level where reviewers understand what you're doing and don't necessarily see all of the flaws that you see. You have to be meticulous. Again, we talked about those personal deadlines and really sticking to them as best you can. References are really important. And with EndNote and the other references tools that we use, sometimes things get really screwed up. And I think that reviewers find that very annoying when they try to go to your reference list and see, you know, something that you referenced in a portion and the references are off or they're incorrect. I wouldn't say that necessarily, you know, kind of torpedoes your proposal, but annoys some reviewers very much, and they will bring that up in study section. So don't disregard your references and making sure that they are appropriately formatted and match the references in your application.
And I'll just add to that, I think anything you can do to make your grant readable and easy. Remember that sometimes people are reviewing multiple ones, not sometimes, usually they are. And so you want to make it as pleasant experience for everybody as possible. So diagrams, figures, bolding, those things that help to make the presentation better.
Yeah, visual appeal sells for sure. Okay, so I guess we'll just wrap up, but you know, you're not doing this in a vacuum. Lots of people have gone before you and have lots of good advice to give you, so please take advantage of that. You know, do not compromise your wellness for a grant. This is one small piece of a very long career. And as the cliche goes, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And then last but not least, you can do it. If you know others before you have done it, you can do it as well. And so just keep on in your persistence.
Thanks so much, Colleen and Andy. Great advice, lots of questions. Keep the questions coming. Just to give you an idea of what we can go on to the next section. We're going to do 2 more sections and then we'll take a break around 3 o'clock and finish up after that. So I'm going to turn it now to Stacy, who's going to talk about specific games.
Okay, hi everyone. I just want to make a comment that was phenomenal. Really enjoyed that session, and that is a tough act to follow. I think that Andy and Colleen, you two should consider putting on a podcast because I think it would be well subscribed to. So thank you for that. I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper dive. That was some really nice broad strokes, giving you the idea of sort of the overarching goals with some specifics for sure. But now, talk about specifics, I'm going to do a deep dive into some specific games. And I think soon in your chat, you'll find a link to a document that is part of a longer version of this presentation. And so if you want to go ahead and click on that, I'm going to as well. Just in order for, if you wanted to follow along or use this later on as a guide, but I think that if you could just open it now, because I'll be sharing some information with a color-coded guide, and then you can refer back and forth, and it'll just sort of give you an idea of how it's going to operate. All right, well, with that said, before this session, I Googled specific games page, and you would not believe the number of hits. This is how many hits came up in a fraction of a second. it's tremendous how much information is out there on the website. And my kids always tell me you shouldn't believe everything you read on the website, which is true. But I think a lot of it is actually really good information. And so all that to say is there really is no set structure. All of those different hits don't agree with each other. There's a whole different ways you can approach this specific aims page. I think that today we've got this wonderful panel of investigators on this Zoom. And if anyone has any specific questions about the exact way to knit together your specific aims page, I'd love for everyone to chime in on those answers, because there isn't just one way. So today I'm going to try to do two things. I'm going to try to give you the options, suggestions, clues, and hints. Welcome anyone to counter them or give an additional way to do it. But then I'm also going to show you one approach on how to do it, which gives you the general idea about what is contained in it. How exactly you knit it together is sort of up to you and up to your own personal type of research. And some of that is going to differ based on the type of research that you do. So getting back to my Google search, the top hit was this publication that is by Monty and Libby. And it was in the Academic Emergency Medicine Journal. So it was very hyper-specific to that field, but it wasn't. It was something that was, I think, really applicable to a lot of different fields. And so I wanted to just mention this to you because I think it's a really good read, and it gives some overarching goals where really beginning with the specific aims page is kind of the start of your journey and really putting together a wonderful framework to your application. You want to, it's for sure academic and science and research, but you can use a little bit of sales pitch in there because you've got to have a hook. It's the overarching goal is to demonstrate a problem, get the reviewer interested and excited and get their attention, and then say how there's a gap in the current knowledge, and then you're going to suggest a solution. The aims that you'll then outline as sort of the roadmap to your research will work towards the solution and will reveal the impact of the proposal on the problem, the field, and the future research. So you can tell we're getting a little bit aspirational here. And you also need to think about, you got to think about everything here. You got to think about the language, efficient and persuasive, and it must really drive a reviewer. Your ultimate goal is to have the reviewer support your application. Because I'll come back to this, but the reviewers of the assigned reviewers to your application will all, of course, read your specific aims page and presumably your whole application. But all of the people on the study section get to vote on your application and get to score it. And many of whom this may be the only page that they read. So you want to make sure that every single word on your specific aim page deserves the real estate that it occupies. So this is a table that came from that publication I just shared. And I really liked it because it kind of sort of translates the sales pitch to the grantsmanship page. And so as it relates to a specific aims page, it's all about the good first impressions. And so you only have that first chance to make that good first impression. And so thinking about how the review happens and thinking about that some people who actually get to score your application and their scores count just as much as everyone else's, you want to make sure that they get the exact information that they need from your specific age page, if that's what they're reading. So now I'm going to go to the second top Google hit, and that's this bioscience writers hit. And so you might have heard of bioscience writers because they've actually been around for over 20 years. And they really do great work. And I know the Georgia CTSA, I believe, has brought them in for different sessions in the past, and they really know what they're doing. And so they sort of have this specific aims Bible, if you will, that's color coded. And so today I'm going to do a deep dive into to the format that they suggest. Again, it's one way to do it. It's not the only way, but I think it is an effective way. And so this is where pointing you to that handout where you can see the color coded example. And I'll tell you when to refer back to it so you can actually map it from the presentation to that session, to that handout. So before we dig deep into that, I do want to just give some overarching information about a specific aims page, which is a one page only, can't go over. Could be under, but it can't go over. And it's a clear synopsis of your research and research aims proposed. It really provides sort of this overview. It's got to be detailed enough to get some information, but the overview kind of, and it's not the abstract, it's more of what I think of as kind of a roadmap. It tells what your proposal is about and how you'll get there. So we'll get into some of this more in detail, but you want to set up the impact, really generate a sense of urgency. Then the rationale, meaning there's a gap and I'm going to fill it. And then what your high level plans are and objectives to help address that and fill that gap. Then you'll list your aims, each clearly defined. And this is that one area where there's a lot of variability, I think, depending on fields and even just preference. And then you'll end with that brief statement of the impact and what you'll learn if it's successful, kind of tying it back to the beginning. This is a saying we like to use a lot, I think, in research as well as in grantsmanship, and really beginning with the end in mind. It's really important. The overarching goal, just always thinking about if this is the only thing somebody on the grant review reads, what do I need to tell them? How do I need to compel them to understand the importance and see that this research will address that gap? But you can't just do that in one sitting. And you certainly can't do that at the very beginning only and hit a home run. It is an iterative process. You'll start it because you're sketching out your roadmap. Then as you write the grant, you'll constantly be going back and refining it. And it probably should be the very last thing that you write, presumably when you're sick of your whole application, but you got to do it. Really, really important. So thinking about this impact gap objective, this is really kind of setting the stage for the framework of the bioscience writer's approach. But before we get there, you really do want to convince those reviewers of the impact. That's the most important thing. Who cares if you have the best designed research proposal ever to decide if chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream? It doesn't matter. There's no health impact on that. You have to really showcase that this is an area worth discovery, to spend money on to investigate. Then you have to identify what that gap in knowledge is, because you have to have a defined gap so that you can have a defined solution. Then you'll showcase your objectives and then preview the approach. Remember, it's this roadmap, your approach, your outcomes, and then how that will address your hypothesis. So let's go through each of these one by one. So that impact is really that clinical or public health significance. And if we're talking about NIH here, it's always got to be about, even if it's super duper basic science, you always want to draw it back to what disease or health condition does it affect. And please don't just do a lot of hand waving here. Can't just say it's super important. Why is it important? Dazzle the reviewers with numbers and citations and whatever the cost to society is. Really using those absolute numbers rather than relative measures alone. Then we go to the center box here, the gap. And so really, okay, so we already know this is important. Well, what's already known? What is going to set the framework and the premise for your study that you're about to tell the reviewer about? You can highlight some of your own work here. Can't afford a systematic review here, but you do need to assume the reviewer is not in your field and give enough information so that you come across as knowing what you're talking about and giving the enough background to know that that's your research that you're about to propose is the next logical step in that field. It really is, the gap is totally setting yourself up so that it's super logical and it completely follows that the research you're about to propose is the next logical step in that progression. And then finally, when we get to the objective, it's really about what you're going to accomplish in this research study and then how it will move the field forward and set you up perfectly for the next phase of your own research. So it's kind of like really just laying a foundation about how you're going to help the science and then how you'll be able to continue on in this same vein to continue expanding the field of knowledge in this area. All right, I'm going to pause for just a second because now we're going to do the deep dive into the specific aims page structure that is suggested by bioscience writers, and you'll see in the lower right-hand corner, the bioscience writers icon, just to give you the idea that this is from them. Are there any panelists want to make any other suggestions on I'll give some tips at the end, but anything else that you want to chime in on before I continue on?
Just that I completely agree that this is worth spending all the time you need because it is going to make or break the grant, frankly. So I totally agree with everything you said and what Lillian put in the chat.
Yeah, Lillian, that's spot on right there. That's money, what you put in the chat.
Yeah, and I think the other piece too, and I see this a lot outside of grant reviewing because I'm the editor of a journal, is just identifying the gap is not enough. So there's a million gaps out there. You have to compellingly argue that not filling this gap has hindered our science, right? So it's not just that nobody has done it. It's why is it, if nobody has done it, that we can't move forward?
Yeah, that's really well said. And that's not easy, is it? I think that another thing, just having other people read it, making sure that you're hitting the mark on that exact point is super important. All right, so looking back at this specific structure, we're going to go through these 4 different paragraphs suggested by bioscience writers. The introductory paragraph, the why, what, how, and who, or rationale paragraph, a specific aims paragraph, and the significance impact statement paragraph. And again, just as a reminder, this is all on one page, so every word counts. All right, so let's take this one by one. All right, so first, the introductory paragraph, we're going to frame the question. So these are just sort of some general information, and then I'll get to the color-coded bit. So have your little handout ready. So first, in the introductory paragraph, you want to introduce the problem and convey the importance. So you want to include all the key words. Again, not just do a lot of hand waving. Bad things happen to many people, but use statistics. And I think that exactly what Lillian said, making sure that the reader knows why this is important, not just that there's a gap, but it's an important gap that needs to be filled, or else something catastrophic can happen. And it really engages the reviewer to kind of gives them the hook, right? Okay, what's going to happen? How are you going to solve this? This is a terrible problem. I want to see how you're going to solve it. Then you do need to concisely convey the current state of knowledge to educate the usually or oftentimes non-subject matter expert reviewers on what is known. They're all scientists, but they're not experts in your field, presumably. And then establish that science problem and the knowledge gap. So a couple of phrases you could use were prior studies were limited by, or a gap remains. And really citing the critical need and the impact to set the reader up for the second paragraph where you're going to introduce the solution. All right, so bringing out your little color-coded example, this is where you can match the colors, the red, blue, orange, and purple. So the hook is explaining what your topic is and why it's critical that you conduct this research. So conveying a sense of urgency and even excitement is perfectly fine. Then you do a couple sentences in blue about what's known, be focused and concise. The orange will be the gap in knowledge, and the critical need, highlighting the issue that your research will address and resolve, is in purple. So hopefully you all are following along on the handout. Because now we're going to move on to the second paragraph, the why, what, how, or rationale paragraph. So where you introduce the solution and talk about the goal, objective, hypothesis, rationale. So the guiding principles here are really introducing the solution to fill the gap that you already talked about in that first paragraph. So you want to address 3 key points, and I'm going to tell you about a 4th as well, but the what you want to do, why you're going to do it, and how do you want to do it. And so really highlighting the steps and progression of knowledge. Again, it's this roadmap. You talk about where we've come from, now is where you start of where we're going to go. And using a payoff statement where you can also include evidence for why your experimental design and or team are best to accomplish the research goals, including some of the, maybe you're the only person in the world who have put these 2 techniques together and created this new framework for how you study it. is really important, is something you can highlight as important here. And looking at that, it's the other W, the who, right? So why you in your research setting are well positioned to do the needed work. And here's just a couple of examples, really talking about you were the first in the group to study this. And so you're the pioneers in the field, or kind of what is your MPI plan? Who are the multiple PIs bringing together a basic scientist and a clinician to make the magic happen, and those sorts of things. So going back to the color coding, if you have your handout ready, where you're introducing the solution in the why, what, how, and who paragraph. You've got your long-term goal is in red. Hopefully you can see that, stating the overarching research goal in very general terms, making sure it's aligned with your funding agency of choice. And I think I saw that in one of the earlier questions at the very beginning of this session, and that is focus to fit funds. You want to make sure that if you've decided to submit to NHLBI, the Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, that you're not all focused on curing cancer, because that would be the wrong institute, even though that might be lung cancer or something like that. The blue on your handout is your proposal objectives, and stating briefly what you will accomplish via your aims. That will come next. And it's not that you'll test your hypothesis. That's not the objective here. It's deeper than that. Then in the orange, you'll explain the rationale. How did you arrive at this hypothesis? Citing the past studies and published literature. So it's not just a guess. It's not just a gut feeling. It's actually supported by the rigor of the prior research. Stating your hypothesis explicitly in purple would be your next step. And then in the green on your handout is the payoff. What new research directions will be made with the possible new knowledge that you will generate through this proposal. Okay, now drum roll, please, because we're getting to the actual specific aims paragraph of the specific aims page. So again, I've referred to this as I've referred to this whole thing as the roadmap of your research plan, but this is where it really gets to the crux of it. So the function of it is multifaceted, really outlining the key steps of your research plan. You're going to spend a lot of time here because this is your baby. You feel like you have to tell them all the details about how you're going to do it because you live it, but you have to think about somebody who you have to get kind of to that sweet spot where it's enough information, but not too much information. Got to really strip it of details because you really want to just tell the story of the logical progression of your proposed work. Each aim can give the details of why the specific aim is being proposed, has to be consistent with the central hypothesis and support the overall project goal. And you can, in this last bullet about if you want to include sub-hypotheses, you can, a small description of a payoff of each aim. These are the kinds of things that are a little bit of the art piece of it. And I think that it might be specific to your field and you probably want to work with your colleagues. And if you have a really good mentor in your field could help you with this as well. But these are the areas that I think you want to think about your reviewers as well and what they're accustomed to seeing. Any other comments or questions about this one? Because I know this can vary a lot. All right, we'll dive into one example, and this may give you some more questions. But if you looking, the form, and I see that Greg kindly put some things in the chat about this, and so he might want to chime in on this. But really making this look good, making it the things jump out to you that should jump out to you, using active voice. It can be written as an outline. You don't have to put complete sentences, but using the action words instead of descriptive words. So for example, you don't want to say cancer will be cured by our scientific team, but our scientific team will cure cancer. And so looking at the actual specific aims paragraph on your handout, this is what the color coding means. We have the title in red, and I love using titles. Really nice kind of bringing you, honing you in, anchoring the aim so you know exactly what it's doing. Then you give in blue some of the 2 to 4 sentences about the experimental approach and how it will answer your larger hypothesis. And then in orange, and do not skip this part, the expected outcome is really important to highlight here as well.
Stacy, there's a good question in the chat that I think we should all comment on. And that is how often we include both a general and then aim specific hypothesis. I actually do it, I'll give an overall goal or an overall goal for the project instead of a hypothesis. And then the hypotheses are contained within the specific aims. And there can be more than one hypothesis for each aim, depending on how complicated it is. You know, maybe Greg or Colleen would like to chime in on how they do it.
Yeah, I generally have a overall hypothesis that frames the bigger picture, and then within each specific aim, you know, I've seen it several ways, and if you use the word hypothesis, it's not necessarily penalized, but sometimes I'll, just for purposes of not being repetitive, switch up the language and say, we posit or we propose that X, you know, or people can say this aim will address the hypothesis. And usually the ones in the aims are a little more granular and specific to what exactly you're looking at.
Yeah, I do exactly the same thing. And I think it also depends how disparate the aims are. Like sometimes they're really different questions, and those will have very discrete hypotheses associated with them. And it'll be bolded out just like, you know, like your experimental strategy and outcome or impact there, I'll also put hypothesis. If the hypothesis is specific to that aim and it's independent of the others.
Stacy, there's also a question in the chat about dependent aims versus independent aims. How if you'd like to address that one.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually have that in one of my don'ts on my don't slide about interdependent aims. Like my first aim is I'm going to develop this mouse model, and then the second aim is I will test the mouse model, which clearly, what if your first aim doesn't work? So, you know, this is a topic of conversation. So I think in general, interdependent aims is generally what we can call the kiss of death. I have heard, and Kathy, I'd love to get your input on this. I've heard some people who do this for a living talk about how there's actually ways that you can propose interdependent aims, but it has to be in a very specific context where the first aim still gives you useful information to continue to pursue the science. I have a feeling that's a really fine needle to thread, but I wondered if anyone on the panel has ever seen interdependent aims that were reasonable.
I think just as you described, they have to be, they can be somewhat interdependent, but they have to each provide new information that doesn't exist before, even if there is some interdependence. I'll let others comment too.
Yeah, I've never seen this work well. I've never seen a case where you've had, one aim and a contingent aim and it's not gotten hammered. But there could be differences between areas. I'm in a completely different area than Stacy and Kathy.
I just want to say that Andrea Moffat found the Easter egg, because I agree with you, Andrea. That example from Science Writers totally has an interdependent aim. And I wondered if they just did that to see if people are paying attention. And you are, so thank you.
I'll just add that I think reviewers often look for things to pick on to make their job easier. And an interdependent aim is usually something that's very easy to pick on. And, I would avoid it if at all possible, consistent with the other reviewers or panelists.
That's a really good question about if patient recruitment can be a part of AIM-1. And I also wonder about that because, if you don't already have, it's almost like I think that you do, this would be my answer, but I'm not an expert in this field, but I would say you have to show that you've got the access to the patients. And that's at least enough premise. But I don't think that patient recruitment in and of itself or creation of a patient registry, I don't think that typically is considered a viable aim.
I would just chime in and say, I think in most cases, particularly in dissemination implementation science, and curious what Justin thinks because he does prevention work. This would be preliminary data. It'd be really important for your preliminary data to demonstrate you had access to the population and you could recruit them and that they would actually be interested in participating, particularly if it's a lengthy intervention or an intervention of some sort or study of some sort that requires a lot of effort on their part. I think developing a registry could be an aim. I think to me that's very different, especially if it was like some sort of a rare, some kind of a rare condition or whatnot. But I'm curious if Justin has thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think kind of not knowing, I guess, if you're thinking about a registry or more for like enrollment in a kind of in a trial or something like that. I think for an R21 where maybe you would be doing like a pilot and feasibility study, I think not so much that recruitment would be an aim, but kind of as part of a broader aim about kind of feasibility of a study and that people would enroll and that they would stay in and that there were no safety issues. I think something like that could be part of an aim. I think not for an R01 though. I think if you were doing potentially a pilot study for an R21 application or some other smaller mechanism, that could maybe be okay.
Colleen, as someone who does clinical research, what are your thoughts?
For clinical research, as far as recruiting the patient, yeah, no, that wouldn't fly.
Yeah, I think that
There's not
preliminary
really
data.
oh, sorry, I was gonna say, there's not really a scientific question there. Like, we're looking to answer a scientific question. So if your aim doesn't answer a question, then I think it's probably not gonna fly.
Yeah, it would have to be about the aim would have to be about strategies to a hypothesis about what strategies work to recruit this population or something
Yeah,
like that.
testing a hypothesis about strategies to recruit, that's different, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. Great conversation, great question. Okay, so we're almost done here because we've done the first 3 paragraphs of the bioscience writer. Somebody found the Easter egg. And now we're going to wrap it up with the significance impact statement paragraph, the payoff from doing the research. So the guiding principle is all about, so thinking about this as one kind of complete roadmap story, this final paragraph closes the loop back to the opening statement where you describe the impact from filling a gap and addressing that critical problem. So it allows you to end on this global and aspirational note, highlighting the specific expectations to be filled by the project and the positive impact on future studies. And I did want to mention that just presumably based on who might be watching this, that if this is a career development award application, it is fine if you are part of the outcome, if you are part of the impact and the development of you and working towards research independence. Overall, you always want to think about your audience, and that's the reviewer, and developing advocacy with them, especially if they're ones that haven't read the rest of the proposal. This is it. Every word counts on this. You want to demonstrate the advancement of the field in an area that really matters. And then you can talk about what's next. This isn't a dead end road. Okay, now we're done. We can go home. We can retire. No, this is like what science is. It's like building to get us closer to, you know, the penultimate figuring out everything in the world. And you can also use this to highlight the qualifications of a team. So in this final paragraph, the color coding is you want to talk about innovation, that's in red, the expected outcomes using plain language, that's in blue, and that impact payoff statement, the aspirational piece about how your project would help those who need it, including about how it will benefit the people that you mentioned in that opening paragraph. So just a couple more things, just overall do's. Clearly and concisely stated, using every word counts, making sure every word deserves a placement on that one page. Usually 2 to 4 related aims, maybe some sub aims, really, you know, checking with people in your field to see what they think what reviewers are most accustomed to. This really should be a perfect page. We're all human, but there's no reason. You should have looked at this so much that, like Colleen said, you probably hated by the end. But you also should be really proud of it. There's no spelling errors or grammar. You've included some nice white space using sort of this formatting strategically. So it's not jarring, but it's strategic. really thinking about the reviewer finishing this section, thinking that you have a feasible approach, the research is significant, and this is the right team to do it. The don'ts, or some of them are just the opposite, not using dense language jargon and having grammatical errors. But I think I like the second one to highlight is never, ever assume. Again, you've got access presumably to a lot of people who are your colleagues and aren't in your field. And so getting lots of opinions to making sure that you're using the right level of language for scientists who aren't in your field. We already talked about the interdependence aims. This may vary a little bit per field, but in the basic sciences, kind of fishing expeditions, even in R01s, even though they're supposed to be exploratory or more high risk, high reward research, fishing is generally kind of the reviewers will hone in on that as an easy thing to criticize. And I think a theme of today will be a common mistake especially in early career investigators is being overambitious. So you really want to check the amount of work you're proposing with seasoned researchers who can tell you if it's too much. I don't think I've ever seen one with too little. So I will close on this, that getting back to that first impression and the sales pitch and making sure that that page counts.
Thank you, Stacy. I know you have to leave, so any last questions for Stacy? Any lingering questions the rest of us will take on in the chat? All right, thanks very much. We will move on then to Greg, who's going to talk about, we'll take a break after this section, who's going to talk about significance and innovation.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today. Hopefully I'll be able to operate the slides. It looks like I might have messed it up already. Hang on a second. Previous. Okay. So yeah, this is the next section in the deck, and this is focused on significance and innovation. These are the following two sections in most typical NIH grant applications, and is really a chance to, you know, frame the impact of what it is that you're doing and how the new work will fit into the paradigm. So really the overall approach, general ones and considerations are, I always say that you want to really spoon feed the reviewer and tell them what to think, but to do so based on data and compelling data. A lot of people sort of make the assumption that a significant section is a background literature review. And that's actually, you know, kind of a flaw in your sales pitch if you adopt this approach, although you do want to have some level of literature review and catch up for the people that may not be as closely connected to your topic who are on the review panel. Keeping in mind, these are multidisciplinary groups of scientific reviewers, whether you're in the public health space, outcomes research, basic science, or translational clinical science. You want everyone to be on the same page, but you also want to fill in the gaps and you know, make sure that you're hammering home the main points. And that gets to the third bullet point, the old saying that repetition is key to learning. It's totally okay to say some of the same things and even the same phrases that are present in your specific games page to drive home your main key points with regard to significance and impact. And the thing I always say is to be your own advocate. This is your chance to really put on your sales hat and sell what the outcomes of your research will provide to the larger field. And, you know, this is sort of a listing of all the key questions whenever I approach a significant section, at least in the basic and translational sciences. This is the hat that I'm wearing, so those in other realms of research are free to chime in. But the first one is quite obvious. What is the important problem or critical barrier to progress that this grant, if successful, will indeed address? The second thing is this concept of prior research, and whether it be your own or whether it be published. And there in the NIH speak, there's a new-ish term called rigor of prior research that you need to address. And you can sort of approach this from what is out there that lends credence to the value of what you're studying. And then you can also, and we'll talk more about this, approach this from the standpoint that all this work has been done, but these are the specific things that are flawed in the prior work that your proposal and your approach that we'll talk about later will now provide the answers to or enhance our overall knowledge of that. The third thing is a very obvious thing, but important to state outright, is that the aims of the project, if you achieve them, how will you advance scientific knowledge? How might you improve on our technical capabilities if you have a highly technical grant, or in the setting of the clinical realm, how will clinical practice be improved? Are there practice changing results that will result from your grant if it's successful? And then, obviously, you want to impress upon the reviewers that successfully completing the aims that you propose will indeed in some way change and improve on whether you're talking about a concept, new knowledge, right? Or methodology, technologies, treatments, services, or some preventive intervention that drives the field. And this is the section to really drive home that point. If you're thinking about clinical trials focused research, there's other caveats that need to be considered. The first is there existing scientific rationale, either again from the literature or from your preliminary data, that supports the need for this trial? Obviously, feasibility is important too in the clinical setting. And you have to lay the groundwork usually in the form of this section and preliminary data provided that these studies are indeed well-founded. So this often is important to emphasize mechanism too in the basic science. And can you use this clinical data to better inform our overall knowledge or mechanistic understanding of a biological problem? For those that are focused on clinical or even public health endpoints, some may often ask if the clinical trial is necessary to test the safety, efficacy, or effectiveness that could indeed lead to this practice-changing result that we talked about, or in the setting of community health, any behaviors or alternatively health policy that could be different as a result of the outcome of your work. And then finally, for those trials that focus on behavioral, psychological, or other biomedical endpoints, do you really need the trial to advance scientific knowledge? Is it properly controlled? And this gets back to, you may have anecdotal evidence from existing literature, but how is your work more well-designed to address those gaps in knowledge and the rigor that is lacking in the field? So some common issues, what are the pitfalls? And these are, sometimes taken verbatim from grant review summary statements, and people often criticize or drop the scores on significant sections for some of these reasons. The first is, not impactful new research or exciting, which sort of bleeds over to innovation that we'll touch on next. People pay attention to preliminary data, and often if it's not very convincing, people will put a bullet point like this: there's a lack of compelling rationale or preliminary data in support of this being a significant topic of research. People will say, this is incremental. This is not paradigm shifting. You want to really, often use those words and sell how exactly this is going to shift thinking, practice, behaviors, what have you. So it's not considered low impact research. There should be a legitimate outcome that is, really shaking the foundations of the field. And then the last thing I put in this slide is we work in the setting of oncology, right? And often you gear your proposals to be very focused on a specific type of cancer, or in non-cancer work, specific disease or behavior. But often reviewers, again, being multidisciplinary in nature, they like to see that there is what we call a generalizable impact. So can the knowledge that you've derived in your own specific niche or system be broadly adapted in some way across fields so that there's more broad impact? And oftentimes it's a wise choice to put some sort of language to that effect into your significant section to show that your work will indeed be transferable to other fields or derivative fields. So more on significance, obviously, this is, everyone knows it's the introduction of the grant to, have the goal that you're convincing the reviewer that this is an important question. Again, this idea of preliminary data being very critical. On the flip side, you have to be very confident and self-critical of the type of preliminary data that you put in. Anything you put in is indeed a target. So let's say you put a graph in there and it's not properly analyzed from a statistical standpoint. If you have an incorrect statistical test, that's certainly something a reviewer is going to pick on. So make sure anything you put in there is airtight. It's not an N of 1 where people will say you're drawing conclusions and then your preliminary data does not support your rationale. So that's something to just bear in mind. And some grant mechanisms don't require preliminary data. Others do. These are all things to really read the statement or the RFA that's associated with your individual grant applications. Many people who have high impact papers, for example, they can often draw on that to provide a good data set in support of their grant. And they'll say, we published this paper, it showed, protein A is associated with protein B. But better yet, and a strategy that has been successful for us historically is, in addition to the papers being published, it's never a bad idea to actually extract a figure, a key figure, a data point from that published manuscript and put it directly in the significance section of the grant. Chances are the reviewer is not going to take the time to go onto PubMed and find your manuscript, download the PDF, search for the figure, read the whole thing when they're trying to get through a pile of 8 or 9 grants in, a weekend and they're hurried. So it's always a good idea, even if it's published, to show them this data and then cite the reference to the paper it came from to really hammer home the point that, this is our main key finding and this is the published data in support of that.
Greg, would you comment on including figures from somebody else's paper in the grant?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I generally try not to, because it's often criticized as it's not your own work, and rightfully so. So you can reference those papers and say, hey, this is in support of our hypothesis. So-and-so et al. Have shown that this mechanism is relevant or something, but again, it's not your own data and you don't want to provide a perception, at least in my opinion, to the reviewers that you're being deceptive and claiming someone else's data is your own.
Totally agree with that.
Any other comments on that point? And there's a comment, figures from a paper of a collaborator on the grant. I personally feel that that is fair game. If you have a co-investigator who's getting effort or an active collaborator, I think that's okay in that they're part of your team. They're providing unique expertise. It is indeed a collaboration, and you're capitalizing off of that history to make this project go. I've seen other folks chime in the chat now in agreement with that. Okay, so just to break down a few other aspects of this section, sort of a framework with which a lot of people operate in writing it. The first is the obvious: state the problem that you're investigating. What is the process, the disease, the behavior, the novel clinical intervention that you're going after? Second, often people will state, reiterate the current state of knowledge that is relevant to the proposal, and then, of course, the gaps in knowledge that this proposal is intended to fill. I mentioned earlier this idea or this NIH requirement of commenting on the rigor of prior research. And really what this means is, what were the issues with the prior studies, or what is lacking in our current knowledge? Did someone do a study and make a conclusion, but they lacked a key control group? Did they make claims based solely on an animal model and extrapolate that unjustly to a human situation? And now your grant would actually take that to the human situation and improve on it. was their work limited to a single experimental model that maybe didn't account for a genetic difference that might be important, and now you're going to tease that out in another system. So it's always good to critically evaluate, not in an insulting way, because keep in mind, some of these people that publish the papers might in fact be on your review panel. So you don't want to make them mad at you or have them think that you don't believe their work, but you want to be very objective and, accurately and factually point out what was missing and how it could be different if your work is completed.
Can
And
I,
then,
can I
please
jump
go
in
ahead.
on that point? Just, I think there's a balance here too, because if your grant is based only on published work and the published work is of poor quality, that means it's a shaky basis for you to move forward. And you can be criticized that there's not a good premise. They used to use the word premise for your study. So there's a balance between critically pointing out the things where there are gaps that need to be fixed, and providing enough of a basis that you have a strong basis for what you're actually proposing.
Absolutely. Any other comments from the panel on that, or the idea of rigor of prior research in your own respective areas of grant writing?
I would just echo what Kathy said. I think you have to be really careful in how you frame your criticism, because you never know who might be reading it. And you don't want to overblow your own. I mean, all research has flaws, right? So you also don't want to overblow and be naive about how your study doesn't have any flaws.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. No, just to that point, I was going to say, just make sure that anything that you're pointing out as a limitation of the prior work then doesn't go on to characterize the study that you're proposing too. So do be careful there as well.
Yeah, these are all excellent points. At the end of the day, the words you put on paper are critically important. So choose them wisely, right? Okay. So oftentimes the significant section, in addition to these components and the necessary background as stated, will end with a big picture relevance to the research. And this can be within the specific field as well as sort of broad applicability across the field. And these are just some tips. Obvious, some are abundantly obvious, right? Be clear, be organized, use subheadings. Don't put just a whole sheet of words on a paper. Break it up for the eyes a little bit. Use a model figure. I'll show some examples of those in the next few slides. Pictures are really, really valuable tools in articulating what it is that you're studying and the importance of what you're doing. Again, this is more of the same, but explicitly state your significance in the topic that you're working on. Talk clearly about the gaps in the field, and then really be cognizant of your preliminary data and why it's relevant. And then again, broad applicability, if possible, of your research finding across the specific project. And this idea of model figures, we'll talk about very shortly. They're very important. Just some other quick things. And these are examples of this idea that section headings can be important. So I apologize that these are highly specific to what I do, but I took them from a few of our own grants, which are on pancreatic cancer. And this is just sort of a strategy for writing subheadings and making them not look like background sections, right? So you want to infuse the impact statement as a subject heading. And this would typically be the part of the significance section that leads a subsequent paragraph where you cite references, where you refer to your own data, et cetera, et cetera. So a bad subject heading would be something like this: background on pancreatic cancer. That looks like a review article from really a freshman in high school or something, or earlier. But one thing that would work, and to emphasize the gap in the field or the impact of the research, would be to frame it in a more specific way and say something like, therapy for pancreatic cancer has not significantly advanced in over 2 decades. It's very specific. It outlines the exact problem, and it outlines the scope and how long the problem has been occurring, and generally is a bit more catchy to the reader. The other thing, the second example I have is just, again, this idea that it's not a background section, role for cytokines in pancreatic cancer. And then, this would be then what the subsequent topic of the paragraph would be. This one cytokine, for those that aren't in the field, I apologize, but IL-6 drives tumor progression and is a relevant therapeutic target. So the subsequent sentences in that paragraph will provide the evidence for this statement. They'll qualify why this is a true statement, supported by literature, supported by therapeutic data. And I see from Dr. Aby a really great example for the dissemination in the chat that you all should read as well. So probably within your own individual fields, the moral of the story is to really dig deep, state the impact from your work, and then be highly specific to be catchy to the reader. Whoops. And then my mouse is not working. So more on this rigor of prior research. This is a bit redundant, so I apologize for that. But this is indeed something to focus on. It is indeed lately a NIH requirement. This is part of a focus area, and this includes, both factors related to the significance of the work, as well as some things that will be talked about later in the approach with regard to experimental design, considering relevant biological variables like sex, for example, male, female, and different biological differences. And then there's a section, again, speaking to how rigorous your work is, that will ask you, at least for the NIH proposals, to provide evidence that you're authenticating your key reagents, biological or chemical or otherwise, that you're using. And this is actually a separate document. So all these things taken together will assure the reviewers, hopefully, that your work will be rigorous and indeed reproducible. So again, the broad significance, the topics should, in the perfect world, narrow in and again, use subheadings that are highly specific, provide context, end with a model figure, and then transition nicely into your goals of the proposal and the hypothesis. And this is sort of narrowing from broad in the beginning down to the specific questions that you're answering. This is just a visual depiction of that. And then, to end the conversation on significance, the model figures are really, really powerful. And, this is typically, some people, if you can fit it, often put this actually on the Ames page itself, which is a nice visual. Most often it ends up in the significance section where you have a bit more room. And it often can really visualize what it is you're studying and where in the process your specific aims and questions will fall in the process, and how this will work. So instead of focusing on the words, the easiest thing is to show a picture. This is one, again, derived from my own grant, where we're looking at a specific interaction between different cell types in a tumor. And this is obviously a tumor in the liver. So you have this liver as an organ, you're zooming into this little dot, and then you specifically outline where AIM-1 and AIM-2 is located in this process. We're studying, in the green box, this little thing right here, the cellular interaction. In AIM-2, we're studying the larger red box, so the cell types in this box versus this type. And this is something that on an individual level, everyone can customize to their own grants. Other things that work is replacing some of the text in the significance section with a model figure. And this is a really great example that from another grant looking at dysbiosis and the microbiome in the setting of the intestine. So instead of writing a big wordy paragraph, often people will put, a summary figure to, beautify what you're trying to talk about, and just summarize it and break up the the viewpoint of the reviewer, so they're not continually reading line after line. And everyone has their own style, but really anything visual, and in my opinion at least, is a win for grant applicants. Any further comments on model figures or strategies in that? Okay. So we'll move just a couple slides, and then I know everyone's hungry for a break. But innovation, although typically the smallest section of a grant, at least in the NIH world, this is a critically important and carefully scored section that can be overall score and impact driving. And clearly you want to state what is novel about your own work and the impact that it'll have. Many times the innovation sections are divided into two frameworks. One, the conceptual innovation, what new knowledge that you will obtain from this work. Again, this idea of will your work shift paradigms, and then the idea that it could result in innovation that is widely applicable rather than in a niche area or a very highly specific area. And then, with regard to basic science and clinical grants, many of these reviewers really love mechanism in disentangling existing or uncovering brand new mechanisms of work. Those from a conceptual standpoint are often viewed as highly innovative. The other thing that reviewers often look for and applicants often highlight are those technologies or methods that are considered innovative. Are you actually using state-of-the-art instruments and tools rather than, some dinosaur imager that will produce low-resolution pictures? Are you using the state-of-the-art, and what new technologies will you employ to address your hypothesis? So this is often an opportunity for grant applicants to sort of leverage these technical strengths present at your institution, and a good opportunity to highlight what is available to the applicants in terms of cores or shared resources at all of the institutions that many of you are a part of or could have access to. So this is the general framework of innovation.
So Greg, could I get you to pause just a minute
Absolutely.
and comment here? Because a lot of times I've seen reviewers miss the whole conceptual part and say, oh, well, this project uses run-of-the-mill techniques. Well, there's only so many ways you can measure protein expression. And so how do you have any suggestions on how to deal with comments like that?
I mean, I'm open to input from others, but typically, I have used the exact words conceptual innovation in my innovation statement, again, to tell them exactly what to think almost. And, the other thing that people can do as a strategy is say, there are this many, or there are no publications on this and this, and, do the PubMed search and quantify it and spell it out to them exactly why this work or this conceptual topic is indeed innovative. And they may come with preconceived assumptions about, this topic being innovative because it's closely related, but not, maybe directly related to the specific disease you're studying.
Yeah, and I would just add in terms of, methodological innovation, it's also really important in like outside of the basic science. So for the kind of work that Justin and I do, it might be, collecting actual physiological sleep data on it, or it might be collecting, dyadic data among partners, or integrating observational methods with experienced sampling methods. So I don't know that the methodological innovations have to be like, a brand new tool you're inventing, but it does have to be, triangulating your data collection methods, or triangulating your sources, or using some sort of an approach that has not been perhaps used in your area. So I think there's a lot of room for methodological innovation in more dissemination and prevention kind of work as well.
I'll let you go on, Greg, so we can finish this section.
Sure, no problem. Here we go. So yeah, just other aspects of innovation. highlight the available resources at your institution. Some of these, if you do clinical work, they can be a unique cohort of patients or clinical specimens that no one else has access to. If you did a trial, if you did an intervention, if you did a unique survey of a population, this is data that's all available to you and is in fact by its very nature innovative, and you'll use it in the conduct of your study. The other thing you can highlight, and this is skirting the lines a little bit, but why is your group the best group and you're innovatively positioned to do this work through your own interactions or multidisciplinary nature? A lot of times people get into their silos and boxes, and this is something that has worked for us in grant applications to highlight why our multidisciplinary team is really the best for this specific work. From a grant writing standpoint, I've found that these sections don't need to be super long. You don't need to spend a page on it. Don't be verbose, and shorter is often better. And we have used bullet points to just say, boom, 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 innovation 1, 2, 3, or conceptual innovation 1, technical innovation, some other facets. And that's just a style thing, and you'll develop your own grant writing style of what works for you. But this seems to be easier on reviewers to, theoretically cut and paste components from the grant application into their grant review, and usually in support of your innovation as the applicant. So, and just to end these, we don't have to go through these in detail, but this is one example of an entire innovation section from one of my own R01s in collaboration with another group. And this is focused on cell therapy for cancer. And, it just outlines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then ends with a big impact statement. And I think people can get the slides to look at these more closely and see, I guess, from an anatomical standpoint, how we've framed an innovation section. It's very direct, it's very to the point, and relatively easy to read. In this case, a lot of technical jargon. So for those in the field, you may appreciate it, but for those outside, just pay attention to structure. And then, another example from a different type of research. This is more intervention dissemination research. This is sort of, again, the same format where you have an introductory paragraph and it says this proposal has several innovations as listed below. And then boom, 1, 2, 3, 4, it directly states what, these interventions, this training will do, the project overall, how it can be scaled up. All these important features are, outlined in a very succinct manner for people to have bite-sized pieces and easily grasped impact on the field and the innovative nature. So I think that's the last slide for this section, and we can finish with some discussion if people have a minute before a break.
So there's a question in the chat, Greg, can you see it?
Yes, I'm wondering, isn't best group focus belonging to investigators section? So often there's not an investigators section in the NIH grants, at least. There are bio sketches that you can do that, but I do see people creatively sprinkle their unique capabilities as a group throughout the application, sometimes even on the Ames page if they have room, or in the approach section as they talk about what they have access to or what they're going to do. So that's sort of a gray area, fortunately, and I would sort of encourage people to take advantage of that and creatively position it where it might help you the most.
I agree with that. I would say repetition is not a bad thing. So they're reading a lot of grants and they're reading them quickly. So if you have something you really want to drive home, repeat it multiple times through the grant, and that can include why your group is so well positioned to do this project. Any other questions from the group? Well, thank you,
I
Greg.
apologize, I have to get to another meeting, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Greg. That was very helpful. I think we all probably need a little break, so Let's take a 15-minute break, come back, and we will start promptly at 3:20. We still have three major sections to go through with y'all. Give everybody a 1-minute warning. We'll start again at 3:20. All right, welcome back. We are going to start off now with preliminary data, then we'll spend some time on the approach and then some grantsmanship tips at the end. So I will turn it over now to Lillian to talk about preliminary data.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kathy. So just as a reminder, I'm coming at this as a kind of more of a dissemination implementation science scholar. So there will definitely be room for other people to chime in who can give other examples of preliminary data. So my examples are going to be somewhat bound by the type of work I do. So I'm going to talk about just some basic things, just a couple of basic points first, and then I'm going to go into some more specifics. So one thing that I think we all agree on is that you absolutely must include some sort of preliminary data within R01. And we'll talk about what that kind of preliminary data might look like. For an R21, sometimes you see preliminary data and sometimes you don't. It's technically not required, but it could be useful depending on what you're proposing in your application. And again, we can talk more about that if there's questions. And really, this is so important because it speaks to the feasibility of your proposal. And I think this is particularly important for less senior investigators, although it's important for everyone. And so it can come in a lot of different flavors, feasibility can, and we'll be going through some of these in just a second. And really, primarily, it helps build confidence that for the reviewers that you can actually execute the project and that you have the right team in place. And it also can provide really important scientific grounding for the study aims. So there's lots of different ways you can think about preliminary data. It could be access to the population you're trying to focus on. It could be your ability to recruit participants, which we already mentioned. It could be prior work by your team that's related to the study aims. It could be feasibility of a particular technique or method. It could be demonstrating what Kathy likes to refer to as a drop-dead experiment. It could be evidence that the measures that you're using, if you're using survey-based measures with human populations, are appropriate for the particular population you're interested in. And it also can have give confidence in the experience and capabilities of the team. So we're going to focus on each of these in a little bit more detail. Is there anything that Kathy or Justin would like to add to this before we move on?
No, I think we'll chime in as we go. Oh, because you go through these.
Great. So the first is access to the population of interest. And so a lot of this has to do with the feasibility of being able to get adequate numbers of subjects. Again, I'm coming at this from a human subjects perspective. And this could include providing letters of support from key partners. So a lot of the work that I do is with healthcare workforce individuals. And so having letters of support from hospitals, from substance abuse treatment clinics, from national associations that they will allow me to go in and attempt to collect data from their employees. And this is really important because often you have to do this during work time. So making sure you have the commitment of those partners that they will allow time for people to step away from their primary responsibilities to fill out surveys or be interviewed or do focus groups. It also can involve approval to gain access to sensitive information, such as health records data. And this could be from patients if you're looking at patients. It could be even from employees if you're looking at human resource data like turnover data or performance appraisal data that might exist in the organization that's collected for another purpose. It can also include data on the characteristics of your target population. So if you really want to make sure you have a mix of men and women or an ethnically, racially diverse population, giving some statistics on that you might get from the organization or organizations you're gaining access to could be really important. And of course, making sure that you have an adequate sample size. So getting estimates of the number of patients, clinicians, healthcare workers, whatever it might be, families, infants, to actually accomplish your study aims. It could also be an advisory board. And I've used this very successfully on prior grants where I've included advisory board members who are high-level individuals at, in my case, substance abuse treatment facilities. And they give advice on the measures and making sure they're appropriately contextualized. They demonstrate support for the project. They ensure that people can take time off to fill out surveys and be interviewed, that someone will be at the organization to help me wrangle people together when I show up. A lot of the work I do is in-person data collection because it's a very difficult population to reach. And you can also use focus group data from key stakeholders, again, to make sure that the issues that you're studying are relevant to that population, and also find out if they'd be willing to participate in a study. And I will often use that as preliminary data. In terms of more specifically on your ability to recruit participants, you could talk about prior experience successfully recruiting from similar populations, including perhaps attrition rates. If you're collecting data over time, you could talk about data from key informants that would participate in the study and include that in terms of focus group data or other individuals who would be highly relevant to your study aims. And if you're collecting data in some sort of an organization or community or external setting, evidence that you can or have been previously able to recruit can be really valuable. In terms of prior work by the investigative team, so this is your core group of either another principal investigator, if it's a multiple PI plan, or your collaborators, making sure that thinking about your research as a whole, you have the expertise related to each and every study aim. We've talked a little bit about this, and it's really important to make sure it doesn't just look like window dressing. In other words, putting someone on the project who's very, very well known in the field, but you have really no experience collaborating with. Maybe they're from a different university. So having even unpublished research can be really valuable. That could be conference papers, working papers, as well as any relevant published research with members of your investigative team. You can also include pilot studies, and that can be very important, particularly for intervention-based work. So even a very small scale intervention study with some promising correlational evidence or effect sizes, even if they don't reach statistical significance, if they're trending in the right direction, as well as evidence that your intervention is viewed favorably and attractive to participants, so people would want to participate in your study. And I've often used correlational evidence demonstrating kind of expected patterns of associations among variables. And I've often pieced this together from different projects. So it's not as though I'm saying, hey, I've already done the study. I'm really just providing some initial evidence that these patterns of associations are what we would expect based on the conceptual model or theory behind the study design. So I will pause if Kathy or Justin have anything to add to this of how they've highlighted their investigative team and prior work.
I don't have anything to add. I think that was very complete.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the one thing maybe I'll add a little bit is remembering, especially as a junior investigator and as someone who's relatively more junior myself, I think here that that this should really be work. I think you want the team can be very helpful to kind of bolster you, but the team kind of like if you're going to be the PI, like it needs to be clear why you're the PI and not like, oh, well, I'm the PI and Lillian's on the grant and Lillian has all this expertise. And so then it's like, well, why then Lillian should be the PI, not Justin. So I think that's one thing to kind of think about here. And even as you're kind of doing your own work, like what kinds of things, as with your long list that we all have about our to-dos, which one are you going to kind of prioritize? Again, that's thinking about the long timeline there. I think the other part to think about, and I think I just quickly quickly skim through. I think we're not really going to talk about the biosketch component, but this is important as well, that this kind of dovetails with this. So if you're kind of pitching yourself a certain way there, you need to kind of make sure that they all kind of sync. If you're going to say, oh, I'm have this kind of expertise, that can bolster there too. I think it definitely needs to be in the main body of the grant as well, but they will look at the biosketches, and so that's another place where you can kind of bolster. But again, the actual work itself needs to be here.
Great, thanks, Justin. The third is the feasibility of the technique or method, and this could look very different depending on the kind of work you do. And it's really can be summarized in terms of evidence that some sort of specialized technique or method could be applied to the study. So in my world, let's say I'm trying to collect data from matched informants. So maybe I have patients and clinicians. Do I have experience collecting this kind of dietic data? Do I have evidence of how I've dealt with issues of attrition? Is the patient population transient? And if it is, what evidence do I have that I can maybe follow these folks over time? Have I made some realistic assumptions about collecting data over a longer period of time? It also could involve the feasibility of obtaining and integrating different kinds of information. And if you obtain data from what we would kind of call archival records, so in my world, that might be things like number of sessions that patients attended, or it might be human resource management data. A lot of that data can be really pretty messy and collected really differently across different organizational settings. So evidence that you can actually get that data, it can be coded in a way that's consistent across organizations without a lot of missing data, can be really, really important. And also availability of resources the availability of resources and expertise to use them. So again, making sure you have the appropriate expertise on the team that can think through in advance how this data will be used, how it will be coded, how it will be scaled, is really, really important. And then also kind of proof of concept, or in other words, I think this drop dead experiment is coming next. And so the drop dead experiment is something that Kathy actually shared with me, and I'll do my best to give it justice. It can look different, I think, based on the type of research you do, but basically it has to do with what kind of experiment or evidence do you need to do to convince the reviewers that the rest of the proposal is worth doing. And so Kathy gave this first example, which I can read the words to you, but basically it boils down to, if you think X is related to Y, then you need to at least show that X causes Y or causes some dysfunction that can lead to some outcome of interest. Another example is if you want to study a disease in a population, you have to show that X% of that population, in fact, has the disease, and that you have access to enough patients or healthcare workers or supervisors that have that characteristic. And Kathy, do you want to add anything to this? I hope I did justice to that first example.
It's really just thinking about the whole grant would fall apart if X or Y is not true. And so if there is not published data about this, or even if there is published data, you need to cite it to make it clear that, so in that first example, you're trying to link shear stress to hypertension via endothelial dysfunction, then you need to show that shear stress causes endothelial dysfunction, number one, and number two, that endothelial dysfunction is linked to hypertension. And then you can make that the link between all three of them.
Right. And I guess another example that comes to mind from my own work is I have done a lot of work studying turnover in substance abuse treatment. And so I had to really convince the reviewers that this is really a huge healthcare crisis in terms of staffing within that population. And so I pulled a lot from government statistics as well, and government projections about the need for this type of an occupation in the future, as well as published reports from NIDA and SAMHSA about high rates of turnover among this population, as well as published reports of high rates of turnover.
Maybe we stop there. Maybe just ask if anybody has any questions up to this point. Okay, we'll keep watching the chat.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I wasn't watching the chat at all. The next is the measures. So if you're using measures and collecting data from from human subjects, often it's important to make sure that the measures you're using are both reliable and valid, and also appropriate for this population. So one thing that I have dealt with in my work is issues around reading levels. So if you're collecting data from patients or from adolescents or from young individuals or individuals who may not have a more than maybe a grade school or high school education, you have to make sure that your measures are at the appropriate reading level, right? And so that's one example, but you also might go farther and rely on previously published work of your own or others to demonstrate that the measures are operating the way you think they should in terms of their factor structure, in terms of whether they're related to things they should be related to and unrelated to things that they shouldn't. That would be convergent and discriminant validity, whether your measures are not highly correlated with each other, such that it would be difficult to make inferences about one type of construct versus the other. And focus group data on the appropriateness of measures can be really important as well, because a lot of times measures can be validated and used with one population, but the wording might need to be slightly changed or tweaked with a second population to either make it more readable or to make it more contextualized or more appropriately contextualized to your population of interest. Getting back to the experience and capabilities of the team, and Justin kind of alluded to this. In my own work reviewing, I can tell you I do look at the bio sketches, but I'm certainly not reading every word. What I'm typically doing is reading the abstract and kind of making a list in my head of the kind of experience that is needed on the team. Oh, they're studying adolescents as well as suicide and depression, right? So we need someone with experience to suicide and depression. We need someone with expertise specifically in adolescents. And we need someone who has, for example, some particular methodological expertise. So I'm actually writing those things down on a piece of paper when I'm reviewing a grant. And then I'm looking at the bio sketch and saying, do they have the right team? Do they have expertise in all these areas? Are they overloaded in expertise in certain areas? And again, looking very carefully at the principal investigator to make sure they've got the chops to kind of the main chops in a substantive area of interest. They don't have to know everything, but they have to be an expert in this case, probably depression and suicide, preferably among adolescents. And I usually do include some sort of a very concise statement in the grant itself that summarizes the unique expertise that each person brings to the team, emphasize the prior collaborations that I have had with those individuals, maybe bring in reference to the advisory board if that's applicable, and also talk about that specific either technical or methodological expertise that's needed to execute the project. So in terms of tips on preliminary data, it's not a required section. You can weave it into the significance, you can weave it into the specific aims and or the approach. I often include preliminary data, I'd say primarily in the approach as kind of the setting up what I'm going to be doing and kind of demonstrating feasibility of the method and the technique that I'm planning to use in my study. You do need to make sure that the relevance of your preliminary data is clear to the reader. It doesn't have to be exactly what you're doing, but it does have to be very clearly related. And that's where using really carefully chosen headers in tables and sections can be really, really important. I also encourage you not to get too far into the weeds on this. This is not a manuscript that's going out for review. You don't have to provide a lot of detailed information on the preliminary data. It's really a focus on why are you reporting it? What does it tell you that informs one or more specific aim? And if possible, again, I would just encourage small scale experiments, pilot interventions, and or some sort of correlational data, depending on the nature of the work you're doing, directly related to those aims. We also heard earlier about the importance of figures, and I think that including, a very selected table of correlations or a table that demonstrates numbers of the target population you'll be able to access, possibly previous attrition rates, reactions to the intervention you might have collected through a focus group to demonstrate people are interested in participating, is really, really helpful because the cognitive load on reviewers is huge. This is an enormous amount of information to process, and the more you can make it easy on them to go through the grant and be able to see very quickly the data that you're providing is really, really important. I do also think that for certain kinds of research, letters of support can be really important, and this could be from community leaders if you're trying to reach a hard to reach population, again, healthcare organizations, as well as specialized expertise of consultants that you might be bringing onto the project whose contribution would probably not warrant being a co-investigator, but they're bringing something to the table that's very important to make sure that you're meeting the aims of the project. So for one of my projects, a big component of it was being able to scale the intervention and reach a large number of substance abuse treatment professionals. So I had letters of support from several professional organizations who indicated that they would work with me to create online courses for continuing education credit for this population. And that was really compelling for my, kind of grandiose ideas about how I can scale this up, particularly with a population that's pretty hard to reach. And I do think that it can be tricky to find this sweet spot between not enough preliminary data and too much. I have absolutely read many grant applications where when I read their preliminary data or look at their prior grant support, I'm wondering what's really new here. It seems like they've kind of already done the work that they're proposing to do. So I think you have to be careful in how you frame your preliminary data so that it doesn't look like you've kind of already done all the pieces of the study and leaves the reviewer thinking, well, what's really new here? Kathy and Justin, anything to add there?
I might chime in on that a little bit because that last bullet point is really important. So it seems like now in basic science applications, the reviewers want to see preliminary data for all of your aims. So it used to be your third aim could be more speculative, but now they're looking to see that you have enough preliminary data that they're convinced that the aims are each going to work. And I'll give you an example of too much preliminary data. I was in study section once where it was back in the days that like what you could do during COVID, where you could provide supplemental data to your application a month before the study section met. And this person sent in a supplement, very proud of himself because he'd published 2 papers relevant to the grant. Well, those 2 papers were essentially aims 1 and 2 of the grant. And so that grant went from being very, the reviewers were very excited about it until they saw that supplemental data. And then they said, what's the point? He's already done most of the grant. And so it wound up with not a very good score. So that it is a really important, careful balance. I also want to just go back and mention where to put it. So I agree with Lillian that putting the relevant preliminary data within the actual aim is a very good practice. But sometimes if you're working in an area that's really new and you need the preliminary data to set up the significance of the grant, sometimes you have to put a good chunk of your preliminary data in the significance section so that the reviewers understand why you want to study what you're studying. So I think it's, there isn't really one place that preliminary data can go. You kind of have to judge where it's best needed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I have often referenced just in passing preliminary data, even in the specific aims, like based on a successful initial pilot study demonstrating providing initial evidence of the efficacy of this intervention, blah, 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 blah. So that the readers say, oh, okay, this is really new and novel, but it's not as though they're going into this without any kind of preliminary data. So again, a little bit of repetition, particularly if something is particularly critical to your aims, I think does make a lot of sense. Justin, anything to add?
Yeah, just the only thing I think I'll add, and I'll kind of hit on this again in my section, which comes up next, is just, again, I do think just for more junior people who have not had lots of grant support, I just think you just need to demonstrate a little bit more that you can do it. And so I think that's where having stronger preliminary data, I do think kind of more senior investigators, sometimes there's a bit of a halo effect here. Because again, remember, grant reviews are not anonymous like they are when you're for most peer review. So I just think here with preliminary data, I think with some of the things that I do in review, it is just this sense of like, okay, you need to convince me that if we're about to give you a lot of money, that you actually will be able to do the thing that you're saying that you're going to do. And I just kind of wanted to emphasize that as well. I think here with, and totally understand. I think for my work, I know this idea of like, oh, well, if you didn't have the money, like kind of for the kinds of things I do, like if I didn't have the money, I wouldn't be able to do anything like the project basically, but kind of small. So I think for me, it's unlikely to be this problem of like too much preliminary data, because it's like, well, I couldn't have run kind of a this multi-year longitudinal study or a big clinical trial or something like that. But so I think kind of for me, it maybe not as much of a too much preliminary data sort of issue, but just wanted to mention that for the people who are applying for some of their first grants.
Yeah, and again, this careful balance between not enough and too much is primarily focused, I would say, on R01s. I don't think that with the R21, I mean, again, you might have, for the kind of work I do, I might have letters of support to show I could actually get into these treatment organizations and get access to patients and or counselors, but I might not have, the pilot intervention, for example. But I might have correlational data showing X is related to Y. And so then if I develop an intervention on X, therefore it shouldn't possibly affect Y. But I can't tell you how many times I have read grants where I've just been underwhelmed with the novelty and felt like they have pretty much already done several of their aims. And I think that is another thing to really avoid for sure.
Because lack of novelty is probably the hardest criticism to rebut if you have to come back with a revision.
Absolutely. Whoops. And I guess that's it for me, unless there's more discussion.
Any questions from the group? You've all been quiet. We wore you out in the first half of this. We'll move on. We're going to skip this break since we just took one and move on to Justin, who's going to talk about the approach, which is the most important part of the grant in terms of where the research in the research plan, this is where most of your criticisms will come from.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, I think, Kathy, you had just said that. And I think Colleen had mentioned that earlier as well, because I think this is an area where people can really kind of get into it. So again, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and most of my work is as a social and behavioral scientist, and do both observational as well as intervention work. And so here, kind of for the research plan, you're really, again, it's kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of what are you actually going to do. So kind of at a high level, what's your overall approach? What are the specific procedures you're going to follow? How will you analyze the data? How are you going to interpret those results? And then also, what are potential pitfalls and alternative approaches? And I'll kind of hit more of these kind of in detail on this subsequent slides. So here, I think it's helpful to keep in mind the review criteria for the approach. And so here, these are kind of directly, so are the overall strategy, methodology, and analyses well-reasoned and appropriate to accomplish the specific aims of the project? And so, I mean, realistically here, if they're not, and you haven't convinced them that they are, they're not going to give you the money, right? Because it's like, oh, you could have kind of the best, you're targeting an issue that's super important and it's super novel. So those are great. But then if you haven't convinced them that what you're actually going to do in the service of that is well-reasoned and appropriate, then you're out of luck, basically. So here, kind of just really want to underscore that first bullet, and they are kind of, the sorts of tips that I'll go over will help you really get to that. The next one here is kind of our potential problems, alternative strategies, and benchmarks for success presented. So here again, the criteria specifically talk about kind of the need to address potential problems and come up with different sorts of strategies. And think about, again, here, if they're about to give you a lot of money, they want to make sure that if something goes wrong, that you're not just going to kind of then be like, oops, I kind of, too bad. And so that there has to be this kind of alternate path that you outline. The next one, if the project is in the early stages of development, will the strategy establish feasibility, and will particularly risky aspects be managed? And so earlier I had mentioned pilot and feasibility studies, which maybe you would do for more like an R21 kind of project. And so there, oops, something just happened. Hold on one second.
Karen, can you bring it back?
Sorry, everybody, my internet crashed. I'm pulling it back up now.
While we're waiting for her to come back up, if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, go ahead. Oh, she was quick.
Yeah, okay. So earlier, so I had, mentioned pilot and feasibility. So again, so here kind of, that recognizing that there's going to be different, kinds of things we'll keep in mind if it's in the earlier stages of development, but they're again kind of wanting to then make sure that you're establishing feasibility and that you're managing risky aspects, which may be more or less relevant for some of you. And then again, the human subjects protections, as well as clinical research, are kind of other things kind of that are relevant. Here you'll kind of get on that, you hit on these to some degree kind of in the actual main document, and then there's some supplemental documents that you'll complete as well. Oops. Okay, Lillian just went over preliminary data. So here that, and some of mine will have sometimes a section on, again, within the approach kind of about preliminary studies, and then kind of throughout the rest of it, kind of when I'm detailing, this is what I'm going to do, I'll continue to kind of harken back to some of the other work that I've done. So, as we've done in our previous work, we will use community-based research associates to deliver the interventions, right? Or, we've previously found that, this will take about this much time, or we've previously found evidence of validity for these measures in this kind of sample or something like that. So I think for me, I kind of will sometimes have preliminary studies that I'm particularly highlighting, and then other times we'll kind of, just briefly mention different aspects throughout. So again, it supports the rationale for the study and provides evidence of feasibility. So here kind of you're thinking about the general kinds of structure, and then here there can be some variability. So there's kind of generally kind of a background and rationale, followed by hypotheses, then the procedures and study design, kind of the data analysis and anticipated results, as well as then the potential pitfalls and alternative approaches. And this can look a little bit different depending on your kind of work. And so sometimes you might repeat this general structure for each of the aims, and then other times this could all be one section. So for me, for example, I kind of had this big intervention study. So they kind of had basically one kind of big overall kind of description of this, and then finished by talking about the specific aims, which kind of got at specific parts of the big study. Other times it might be three separate studies, and then you would kind of have the same sort of structure for each of those. So I thought maybe, Kathy, do you just want to, I think that kind of applies a little bit more to you than to Lillian. So I thought maybe you'd kick us off.
Yeah, so for basic science and often many clinical research type grants, you would do this for each aim. So you would repeat the aim in bold, and then list each of these sections as Justin explains. I think there's two parts here that I think are really important. One is the hypothesis. You need to clearly state a hypothesis, and everything that you say after that has to relate back to that hypothesis. Otherwise, it becomes diffuse and difficult to follow. The other part that's really important, I think, are the alternative approaches. If you get a reviewer who's worked in your field, has maybe done something pretty similar to what you're proposing and know that it's not going to work, you better have thought about how else you're going to approach it if that fails, or otherwise you're dead in the water. So that alternative approaches section is really important. And I know Justin's going to talk more about that.
Yeah, and I don't know if Justin, I don't want to steal your thunder. I can't remember if you're going to mention this. I think that a kind of a sub point of that alternative approach is telling the reader why you didn't do something else, right?
Yeah,
are you going to get there?
Yeah.
Okay, stop.
And you see a question from Sam. So yeah, preliminary data being the background rationale here. Yeah, it could easily kind of fit there as well. Kind of again, depending on what exactly you're doing. So let me kind of keep going because then I get into this. So again, sort of structuring based on specific aims. As Kathy said, repeat the specific aim verbatim, provide background and rationale for why it's important, and then repeating any specific hypotheses. If it's one big project, I think it's often helpful to kind of start with a high-level overview of what you'll be doing before you're getting into the specific procedures. I have an example of this on the next slide. So here, kind of just briefly, we propose to deliver a responsive parenting intervention. It's focused on this. It includes this kind of guidance. This is the general design. It's an intervention group compared to a control condition. This is where we're recruiting. These are the procedures. Then this is followed by a lot more detail about it, but I think it's often helpful here, again, with this, there's only so much information you can intake at once, as you're probably realizing from sitting in on this long presentation. But here you want to give people a bit of a roadmap about where you're going to go, especially if that map is going to be pretty long. So you can just see that sample high-level overview there. Then you're going to get into, so here if it's so this could be within each specific aim or just overall for the procedure/study design, what are you going to actually do? And here you really need this to be clear to an outsider. Again, remembering that the people reading this are experts, but they're not necessarily experts in your specific area. And most of them would not be, right? Like maybe one of the 3 reviewers would be, but the other 2 would most likely not. This is, again, very different from manuscript review, where the person most likely is an expert in that specific area. So because of this, I find it helpful to start with more detail than I'll eventually have and then cut down here based on space limitations. But I think you really want to write it all out and then figure out what's most necessary. And here I have down the parts that are more elaborated should be the more unique parts of the study. So here, if you're testing a new or novel measure, then you really want to elaborate on that measure, right? Or if something that's either more unique or very central. So, Lillian had given the example earlier about an intervention, focused on adolescents with suicidal ideation and depression. If you're talking about the primary outcome measure there about a suicide measure, a measure of depressive symptoms, like you really need to make very clear that there's good evidence of those measures and their applicability in that population. So here the parts that are more elaborated really should be tied to, again, the more unique parts of the study or potentially the more central parts of the study as well. So here the content varies a lot based on your type of research. So we'll pause and give some examples after this. So here, just from the intervention study that I was mentioning, I just thought you could see, so here what was the recruitment site, how are participants going to be enrolled, how are we going to randomize and stratify them, then a detailed description of the intervention conditions, as well as as you can see it, and then I have the page numbers or how much page space this all took up. A description of the assessment procedures and measures as well. And so here, this is just one example. For some of you, you would have none of these kinds of things. And so if Kathy, maybe we'll start with Kathy and then go to Lillian about the sorts of things you would include in your procedure stuff.
So that's interesting you use that word. So I would make a distinction between procedures and methods. And so if you're studying, say, a cell culture system, and you're going to treat the cells with some sort of agonist, and then measure outcomes, you need to state all your experimental conditions, what the controls are, what the interventions are. That's the procedure. The method is how you're going to measure the outcomes. And so you don't have to go into great detail of all the details of your buffers and the how you do a Western blot or how you use PCR to measure a gene. You don't need all those details. They're going to trust, especially if you've published before, that you know how to do the basic types of techniques. What they need to know is what the conditions are that you're going to manipulate, and whether or not you have the right controls, and whether or not you have enough repeats to make it statistically accurate. I'll turn to Lillian.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to, the kind of work I do is not the same as Justin, but similar enough that I think this is great. I mean, I probably would spend a little more time on the recruitment side and participant enrollment, just because I tend to work with kind of hard, really pretty hard to reach types of employees that are scattered all over the United States. So I have to make a case for doing like on-site site visits, which is quite expensive. But survey work just would not, internet survey work. These people don't even have their own offices, let alone they're sharing computers. And so I would probably spend more time on that, but I would definitely spend a lot of time on the assessment procedures and all of these archival data and things of that nature. So.
Okay, and again, feel free to kind of put questions in the chat at any time. I'll just kind of keep going. So then here kind of is some design considerations and justification. So this gets kind of at what Lillian had mentioned earlier. So it can be useful to detail some of the design considerations and justifications for why your approach is better than other approaches, particularly in cases when this isn't something you'll be able to change later. So soon I'm going to talk about kind of the potential pitfalls and alternative approaches, but this is different from that because kind of with the alternative approaches, kind of I would think about that as like a plan B, whereas this is more like, oh, you're going with plan A and there's not going to be a plan B about that thing. So you can see here, this was for an intervention focused on sleep in infants. And here kind of we were basically trying to justify, we had these self-report measures from mothers about their infant's sleep. And then we also had actigraphy data from moms. At the time we did this grant, there was not good evidence on actigraphy data from infants. And so, and again, this was, that wasn't going to be the point of this trial, was to demonstrate that. And so here, we needed to be very clear, like we don't want actigraphy data from infants because there's severe methodological issues. Here are some of them, and kind of that these can underestimate treatment effects, for these other things, which is problem in a context of a trial. So because of this, this is why, what we are doing is better. And so there, and I think, we might have still had a reviewer argue with us about that, but here at least we gave them something to argue about, because this was not something where it was like, oh, by the way, like, maybe like 3/4 of the way through, if things aren't going that well, then we'll add the actigraphy data. That wasn't actually going to work for us in this case versus, when I talk about the alternative approaches. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind here, that you want to make it, in some cases you want to be very clear, like Lillian was giving the example from hers about like, look, like we can't do internet survey research for this population. Like we need to go in person. And so again, maybe someone would still argue about it, but again, that they're really kind of giving a strong justification there. Kathy, is there anything you want to say about this or? No, okay. So then kind of thinking then, kind of moving on about data analysis and anticipated results, kind of wanting to detail the analyses that you'll use to address each specific aim. So, maybe if yours is structured kind of in the context of you're doing this for each specific aim, then you won't need to do this. But for things like mine, and I know for Lillian as well, sometimes with kind of one big overview, kind of finishing with the specific aim analyses, then you would repeat the aim and then describe what you'll do to test it. In my experience, kind of for early career investigators, I think more detail is often needed here to demonstrate that you know what you're doing. And so I had some experiences where I kind of was looking at a more senior investigators thing. I essentially kind of, I adapted obviously, but I essentially just copied their structure and then kind of got all these critiques from the reviewers about like, oh, what about this and what about that? And so again, I think you need a little bit more detail there to just demonstrate that. And again, here you often would have a statistician helping out with this. Want to demonstrate rigor by discussing power, controls, covariates, how missing data will be handled, et cetera. Again, kind of demonstrating that you know what you're doing and that the results will be kind of trustworthy and strong. And then finally, kind of anticipated results. What do you expect to see and what would this mean? So then kind of this potential pitfalls, which you keep coming up. So kind of, again, you want to acknowledge that there are potential problems that could come up. Remember, that's one of the review criteria. You want to show that you've thought through these. So your design should have preempted extremely serious concerns. And so the issues that you raise should be ones that you're well equipped to handle. So you don't, again, want to raise these like super serious problems that then they're like, wow, that is a really big problem. You're right, we probably shouldn't give you the money for that. And so here again, kind of that the design should be strong on its on its own, basically preempting some of these very serious concerns, and that the issues that you raise are ones that you kind of are kind of reasonable to address. And so here kind of, that brings us into these alternative approaches. So detailing a few alternative approaches shows that you have backup plans if things don't work out the way you thought, and that the project will still move forward successfully. But kind of making sure that these don't sound better than your primary approach. And so I think Kathy had an example that I'll let her describe, because I will just bungle it about kind of if technique A doesn't work, then I'll do technique B. But kind of here that you want to make it sound like, well, there's a good reason why you're using technique A, and not for them to say, well, you should just be using technique B from the beginning. For my world, I think something here would be maybe more in line with recruiting, that we have this. We have this partnership set up. We've, based on our existing numbers, we believe we'll be able to hit enrollment targets. And we think kind of proceeding with just a single recruitment site is best because it reduces other kind of noise in the data. However, if by X point we are not hitting recruitment targets, we have, this other kind of site that we have a pre-existing relationship who has agreed that we could expand recruitment to there, or something kind of to that degree. But, Kathy, do you want to kind of?
Yeah, so this is one of my pet theories about grant writing, which is that this is a really important section of the approach. Because if I do this when I'm reading in grant, I'm saying, gee, they should have thought of this. And if the next sentence is, well, if we see this, then I'm going to do this thing to fix it. I have a lot more confidence that they've thought through this and they'll be able to do what they say they'll do. So I structure this section with if-then statements. So I go through every one of my anticipated results that Justin talked about on the last slide. And I say, if this doesn't happen, then I'm going to do Y. So it could be a technical issue. Maybe I'm transfecting cells and I can't get it to work. So maybe I'll switch just isolating cells from a knockout animal. So there can be a technical alternative that you're proposing, or it can be conceptual. It might be that the pathway you're proposing is not quite the right one, and there's an alternative pathway that you could look at. You didn't choose it first because, like he said here, it can't sound better than your primary approach. You had a reason why you didn't choose it first, so tell them what that is. But then tell them that if your primary approach doesn't work, that you can look at this other pathway. So if then for every single one of your anticipated results. I'll stop.
Lillian, is there anything you wanted to add about this, or kind of anything else?
Yeah, I think just another, I think recruiting is a great example for the kind of work you and I do, and absolutely essential. But another might be, let's say you're proposing some sort of a mediated model where X leads to Z leads to Y, but there is kind of a possible competing explanation of what might be going on in the middle there, like another mediating mechanism, but there's not a whole lot of strong support for it. But there might be enough support to where you say, even though I think that the mediating mechanism is coping, it's possible that there may be some other explanation. So I'm going to include a measure of that to rule that out as an alternative pathway. That would just be another example. But again, you want to make sure that the mediating mechanisms you've chosen make more sense, right? Or you could say, it's possible that there could be gender differences in the reaction to this intervention, because we know women are more open to, whatever it might be, open to the intervention or open to this kind of interpersonal intervention. There's really not a lot of huge amount of evidence to support that, but we're going to examine it and see if that could be a boundary condition, right? So I think those kinds of things can really, again, you're trying to preempt the reviewer who might be thinking, well, what about gender? What about this? What about that? How do you know it's coping and not something else? So I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think maybe another example, I do a lot of longitudinal work. And so, there maybe kind of in my conceptual model is like, oh, I'm expecting this to operate at a 1-year lag, but I'll also test it over the 2-year lags as well. And I think some of these can kind of just be more of like, again, you're briefly acknowledging it. You're not kind of getting into a lot of detail. And you're kind of, again, throughout all of this, you're really kind of guiding the reader and just being basically like, hey, like, don't worry, like, I've got it, right? Kind of don't worry about it. I'll look at that other stuff as well. Because again, I think like Kathy said, like we said earlier, I think this is really a section where people, I think as reviewers, I think we're all kind of trained in the method. So even if if the significant section is written well, especially if it's not in your area, kind of, you're kind of just more along for the ride of like, oh, you said that this thing is really important and you gave good stats about it. I believe you, like that sounds really important, right? But then when you kind of end up getting to the method, I think even there, if you don't maybe have the content expertise, a lot of times you would have some of the method expertise, and you really kind of want this to be tight kind of throughout, and detailing some of these alternative approaches will help with that.
Let me go back to what you said about the serious flaws. So if there is a serious flaw and you just ignore it, the chances are the reviewer is going to pick it up and comment on it. So if you detect a serious flaw in your approach, go back and fix the approach. If there really is no way around it, you might have to just say, if this happens, then we're going to conclude X, Y, Z and move on. But don't ignore it completely if it's something that everybody else is going to think of. You need to show that you've thought this through completely.
Yeah. Great. Well, any other questions before we move on to Kathy?
Well, we're going to we will finish early, I promise. We're going to do a quick recap of the important points you heard throughout the day, and then give you some tips about grantsmanship that aren't really part of any one section of the grant, but just things that you need to work on as you put your grant together. So I used to have a slide that said the 7 deadly sins, and then I got together with this group and they actually turned into 10. So the 10 deadly sins of grant writing. Sorry, there we go. Nope. There we go. So the first 2 here are probably the most common criticisms for early career faculty. So having a diffuse or unfocused research plan, we talked about that as when we were talking about the research plan. If what you propose does not directly address the hypothesis and you're kind of all over the place, it makes it really hard for the reviewers to understand what you want to accomplish. Overambitious is the most common criticism. And someone said earlier, check with a senior investigator about whether what you propose is doable or not, because junior investigators, and I did this myself, tend to get really excited about what they want to do, and they can see what they want to do for the next 20 years, and they put it into a 5-year grant. And there's no way you can get it all done. You may think you can get it all done, but there's no way you can get it all done. And so really think carefully about, is this doable within the time period and the financial constraints of the grant? Is it feasible to do the work that I'm proposing? Are the aims dependent? We talked about the kiss of death on dependent specific aims. Lack of novelty and significance comes up a lot, especially lack of novelty. And people will say, well, the grant's incremental. Well, it really may not be, but sometimes you have to make a better case for why it's novel. And that's why bulleting the conceptual and technical novelty of a grant is really important. If your studies are very superficial, so in my world, mechanistic insight means something different from Lillian and Justin's world, but if your studies are superficial or not fully developed, that is a ripe area for criticism. So if you're doing clinical research or basic science research, you want to provide more insight into how things work, more insight into mechanism. For Lillian and Justin's type of work, you want to make sure that you've fully developed your studies. And I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that particular bullet point, Lillian or Justin.
I mean, I guess I would say, I think it can vary, but, I mentioned that mechanistic in my world would be understanding those mediating mechanisms, the why, which is probably not that different from what you're talking about, Kathy. So if you're designing, like Justin designs his parenting intervention, and the intervention leads to better sleeping, my guess is he probably is also trying to disentangle, well, why is that the case? Like, what's the conceptual foundation for that? What's the theoretical rationale that would link those two things? And so I agree that, like, superficial, and for me personally as a reviewer, this is me personally, if there's lack of any sort of theoretical framework or conceptual underpinning, that's really the kiss of death, in my opinion. But that could be idiosyncratic to me.
The other thing I'll just kind of add, I guess, kind of about this mechanistic point is, because I know it's a diverse audience, is that there's some kind of, like, I know NIMH, for example, has changed to, like, their clinical trials have to be mechanistic now. So I think that is just one thing here, kind of for all of the things that you're doing, like, you do just need to kind of be very kind of careful about checking to make sure that what you're doing actually is matching as well. And so, again, I think for NIMH in particular, kind of, lacking mechanic would basically just not get funded by them. But in general, kind of more broadly, I think kind of, again, you want rigorous and kind of new insights.
And we just finished talking about the lack of alternative approaches and anticipated results. So we'll just move on. Also, lack of or inconclusive preliminary data. I have seen grants that you lose the reviewer in the very beginning when you're presenting the preliminary data because it's not convincing. So very small n or huge error bars or things that actually contradict. I've seen this happen too. Somebody will present preliminary data, they're very happy of it. I'm looking at it thinking, I interpret that completely opposite from the way you interpret that. And so that can be a big problem. Something that's harder to fix in the relatively short time frame of a year that you're preparing this grant is a lackluster track record of productivity. So you really do need to continue to publish and to show that you are continuing to publish even while the grant is being reviewed and revised. If there's a lot of criticisms come back to say, well, you've never done this particular part of the study, and really that's easily answered. You have to add an expert in that area to your team. The last thing, and this is number 11, not number 10, the only grant that you have no chance of getting is the one that you never submit. So my particular chair has a saying that he says he uses the carpet bombing approach to grant submissions, and that is write a lot, submit it all over the place, and one of them's going to hit. If you think about grants having a 10 to 15% success rate, you're going to write 10 grants before you get one, or 8 or 9 grants before you get one. So I know that sounds depressing. It doesn't usually exactly work out that way, but don't be discouraged if your grant is turned down early, because it happens to all of us. So tips for successful grants. This was one of the questions that you put in the chat early on. So first of all, we talked about preparing before you start. Do your homework, make sure you know the literature, make sure you understand. Polish your application. And then we're going to talk about how to polish your application. I want to reiterate some places where you need to explicitly address the review criteria, and then understand the review process. And we'll talk about that at the end. So before you start, we talked about reviewing targeted research topics, identifying your area of interest, but really think about, you want to have a creative, significant, and exciting idea. That is the basis of all grants. If you can't convince the reviewers that you have a new and exciting idea, it's going to be difficult to get the grant funding. So make sure you're applying to the correct institute, the correct funding announcement. For example, we've talked a lot about R21s, but my particular institute, NHLBI, doesn't fund R21s. So I would have to have a project that would fit with another one of the institutes. We have emphasized over and over the importance of talking to your program officer and the importance of perfecting that specific aims page. I like this because this is really what a reviewer is supposed to be. He or she should be a skeptic. A skeptic is someone who is willing to question any truth claim, asking for clarity and definition, consistency and logic, and adequacy of evidence. And that really summarizes what you need to do with your grant. So when you've done all of this and you have mostly the grant the way you want it to be, there are lots of things you need to do to go back through the application to really polish it and make it as perfect and clear and concise as it can be. So the first is conveying enthusiasm and confidence. So use words like that. We have exciting new preliminary data. We are uniquely positioned to do this project. The use of a hook is, Stacy talked about that, but it's really important. And I have a great example from a colleague recently who submitted a grant, and the hook, the first line of the grant was, "Is the human race heading for extinction?" Well, I'll tell you, that makes you want to look, makes you want to read more. Why do they think that? Turns out they were studying male sterility. So it certainly was a good hook to get you to read further. Confidence is another thing. They have to balance here confidence and arrogance. So you don't want to come across as arrogant and condescending. The reviewers are strong scientists. They may be leaders in your field, and you don't want to come across as you know more than everybody else. But you can tell them when something that you're going to do is groundbreaking or paradigm shifting. You don't want to just say, well, I'm going to characterize something or I'm going to observe something. You're actually going to demonstrate it, or you're going to prove it. So strong power words are important to use, especially in your aims. If you can, avoid hedging, so especially using multiple hedging words in a sentence. So you don't want to say, well, I might see this result. You say, I expect to see this result. You definitely don't say, I may possibly in certain circumstances see this result, because that really weakens what you're trying to get across. Compelling logic is really important. So you want one thing to lead to the next, lead logically to the next. I mentioned earlier reading a grant where I think, oh, well, they should have done this. In the next sentence, they suggest that they're going to do that. That is somebody who's really made a logical grant. So make sure you define your main point, use evidence to support your claims. So cite a reference, provide preliminary data, organize your writing so that one concept or idea leads to the next. And we talked about the alternatives already. So using transitions. So, here are 3 points related to my main area. And because of those 3 points, therefore, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Alternatively, I might need to look at ABC, or in contrast to something. So it helps you link one paragraph or one sentence or one idea to the next one. Writing with clarity. So being concise is really important in grants. Having very complex sentences that the reviewers have to concentrate on to understand doesn't do you any favors. And this picture is an old school, the way the grants used to be submitted. We used to have to submit 18 copies of a grant that was 25 pages long. That was not counting the supporting data. And you got it shipped to the NIH, and it showed up in the mailroom like this. And then when you were the reviewer, you got a box full of all of these applications. That was a box that probably weighed 50 pounds. It gets delivered to your office. And you're wading through all of this paper. Now we wade through it all electronically, but it just gives you a visual concept of just how much reviewers have to read. So short, simple sentences, short paragraphs, avoid jargon and too many abbreviations. There is nothing more annoying than reading a grant where they've abbreviated every other word because they were trying to save space. You can use abbreviations that are well known, like DNA, but you don't want to use abbreviations that are just something you made up so that you can save space. Maintain your verb tense. There are certain tenses when you're describing what experiments you're planning to do, you would use future tense. Describing your preliminary data, you would use past tense. But usually you're using present tense as you write the grant. Someone already mentioned using active voice. Make sure that you have a high degree of scientific rigor. Rigor is something that is very important in grant reviews. Reviewers are specifically asked to comment on the rigor of the proposal. So if you don't use rigor in your writing, so being precise, you're writing about science, it starts raising questions in their mind about how rigorous your science will be. So every word does count. We talked about the importance of using figures and tables to improve clarity. Here are some other examples. I think Greg had some good pictures, but I think also the use of tables can save you a lot of space. So if you think about this table where they're describing the primary study outcomes, the times that they're going to be collecting data, the biomarkers, host covariates, how long would that have taken you to write in text? And it's very easy to understand when it's in table form. So make your application easy to read and attractive. So make sure that after you've done all of this, you go back and read it one last time. And I know when I get to this point, it's all I can do to force myself to read it yet again. But this time you're reading for typos and formatting. Put boxes around your figures and legends so that they look neat. Make sure that they're readable. You don't shrink them down so small that the reviewer can't read your axes, for example. Make sure the tables are legible. And if possible, leave space between paragraphs and sections and don't crowd the page. It's much harder to read a grant where you've squished all the sentences together because there just wasn't enough room than it is to go with spaces between the different sections of the grant. But sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes there just isn't room. This is really important that we've talked about multiple times, is explicitly addressing the review criteria. So throughout this, we've told you what the questions are reviewers are asked. So in the significance and novelty section that Greg talked about, the first few slides were the directions given to reviewers, the questions they're supposed to ask about whether something is significant or not. So make sure you describe the significance of your project by relating it to the problem, the gap, and how it's going to improve way to measure, gather, analyze, improve cost effectiveness, quality of life, etc. We talked about separating conceptual novelty and technical novelty. It's really important to do both, because otherwise they tend to focus on technical novelty, because conceptual novelty is harder to get across. Scientific rigor, we talked a little bit about this, and I think I need to point out two things about scientific rigor. So it's a good idea to put a paragraph in your grant, in the approach section, that starts with the words rigor and reproducibility. And then you talk about what you're going to do to make your study rigorous. So pay attention to statistical power and sample size. If you use animals, talk about your breeding strategy and verifying the genotype. Talk about the sexes. Talk about how many times you're going to repeat what your power analysis is, how you're going to verify the background, etc. But there's also another part where you have to think about rigor, and that is when you talk about the rigor of prior research. So the premise of the work that you're proposing, is it based on good, solid preliminary data? Is it based on good, solid previous publications? You have to make that case as well. Sex as a biological variable is actually called out to the reviewers in the approach section, and the reviewers have to comment on whether sex as a biological variable was appropriately considered. That doesn't mean you have to use both sexes, but if you don't, you have to have a good reason why you're not. So you now have a perfect grant and you're submitting it to the funding agency. And I want to spend the last 3 slides talking about how the grant is reviewed once it gets there. So when it gets to the funding agency, it gets assigned to a study section. The study section is led by what we call the SRA or the SRO, the Scientific Review Administrator or the Scientific Review Officer, depending which institute you are. And then that person, along with the chair of the study section, assigns your grant to a primary reviewer, a secondary reviewer, and what we call either a reader or the third reviewer. The remainder of the study section members get a copy of your proposal, but they don't actually have to read it. And as Stacy alluded to, many of them only read the Ames page to get an idea of what the grant is about. So when you think about how your grant is reviewed, the success of your proposal rides on those 3 people who read your grant. That primary reviewer has to be your advocate. So he or she or they will present the proposal to the rest of the study section, and they'll talk about the strengths and its importance and its weaknesses. Often the study section has, 2 major foci, and half of the group is about, pulmonary hypertension. The other half talks about COPD. And so they have different priorities. And so this reviewer has to convince all of them that this grant is worth funding. So make it as easy as you can, because it's a lot of work to be a reviewer. So then each, as Colleen mentioned earlier, each criterion, so significance, investigator, novelty, approach, and environment, are all scored separately from 1 to 9. This is the criteria table that reviewers are provided with, and in terms of what the descriptor means related to that. And they're really focused on the overall impact of the grant. So after they've graded each one of the 5 criteria, they give an overall score. And the overall score is not the arithmetic average of the other 5 sections. It's very much based on the impact. So if they think it's a high impact grant, they need to give it a 1, 2, or a 3. If they think it's low impact, they'll give it a 7, 8, or 9. Because they can put more emphasis on significance or more emphasis on approach, depending what they think is the strength or weakness of the grant. And then once the grants have a score like that, it gets multiplied by 10. So if you had a perfect score of 1, the score that you're reported would be a 10. And then they take it and they percentile it against all the other grants in the study section from the last 3 rounds. So what they're trying to do here is avoid situations where one study section is different from another. So within the culture of that particular study section, you could get different, a score can equate to a different percentile. So for example, your grant has an overall impact score of 35 once they've averaged all the scores from all 20 reviewers. In the first study section, 35 may equate to the top 10% of the grants they've reviewed over the last three panels. And your percentile then would be a 10, which would be fundable. In another study section, that 35 may equate to the top 25% of grants of scores over the last 3 review panels. Your percentile would be 25, which, unless you're a new investigator, would need to be resubmitted. If your grant is called not discussed, it means it fell within the lower 50 to 60%, that depends on the institute, of the initial score. So when reviewers look at a grant, they provide their initial level of enthusiasm. They send it in like a week before the study section meets. And then the SRO lines them all up and says, okay, these are in the lower half. We're not going to discuss them. We don't have time during the study section. And if you're unlucky enough that your grant was in that lower 50%, you'll get the comments of the reviewers, but you won't have the benefit of all the study section discussing your grant. And that means you need to really look carefully at what they didn't like before you resubmit. There's an example here of what the percentile scores that were funded by NIAID, and again, it differs across agencies. But you can see between 2017 and 2022, for R01s, they're funding 11 to 14% of the grants. So it's tough. For R21s, the success rate is higher. So between 28 and 32% of the grants, and they give a relatively small bump to new investigators. But this is just to say, don't be discouraged if your grant is not funded on the first try. Most grants are not funded on the first try, and you have to resubmit. And we may revisit that in a future session. So if you've written a successful grant, it is hypothesis driven with a solid foundation. It's impactful, insightful, feasible. It's relevant to human health. It's clearly written and illustrated. It's well articulated with an appropriate approach. It has thoughtful contingency plans, compelling preliminary data, and a strong investigative team. I will pause there and just ask if Justin or Lily want to add anything.
I guess just one thing, so with this relevant to human health, like it also needs to be relevant to an institute. So, here kind of coming back to making sure that you're talking with the program officer ahead of time. You could write again like this terrific grant, but if there's not an institute that is interested in that work, it's not going to end up getting funded, because I think one of the things we didn't quite make clear is that the study sections for the most part are separate from the institute. So, maybe you're interested in your work kind of being funded by the National Cancer Institute, for example, but it's not a national, for the most part, it's not a National Cancer Institute study section. So it's going to go kind of to the study section. They might love the grant, and then the National Cancer Institute could say, actually, like, we're not interested in that. And so you don't want that to happen. So I think, again, kind of just emphasizing on the front end, making sure that you would have someone to have some buy-in, because again, and here for the successful grant part of, if it doesn't end up getting picked up, it's not going to be successful, even if all of these other things end up being true.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would augment that and say, it's got to be really contextualized to that institute, right? And for some of us, that might be pretty easy, but I think for kind of like the work that I do, I mean, I could study clinicians in any kind of context. I could study them. I could go to the Nursing Institute. I could go to NIDDK. I could go to NIH or NIDA. I could go to NIAAA. But I have to really think about which of those institutes is really interested in workforce issues. And then I have to really contextualize my thinking around substance abuse treatment, which is not necessarily the way I'm trained. So I think this issue of making sure, talking to the program officer, making sure that not just the institute, but also the program that would actually fund that work is interested in those issues. And I will say this, like 90% rejection rates can be pretty daunting for an R01, but it actually is better than a lot of journal rejection rates. So I would just say the payoff of writing a grant is it allows you to do the best science you can do. For some of you, it's absolutely essential for your promotion, tenure, and future success. And even though those are daunting percentiles or percentages of rejection, they're not as bad as some of our elite journals, at least in my area. So, I mean, and you get this huge payoff. So we've all had, as Kathy said, we've all had grants rejected. And you just really have to continue to develop those ideas. And I would suggest too, another deadly sin is submitting before you're ready, like rushing it. That would be my advice. I realize there could be different norms based on your discipline, but I took a ton of time with my first R01. I mean, months and months, like 6 months, like writing and thinking and did it actually did get funded, which was amazing. And I think it was a good idea and it was novel and all that, but it was because I really took time to think through all of these things and looked at other grants that have been funded and were successful. So that's another piece that's really important, is leveraging those investigators who've been successful, even if it's not directly in your area, to see how they structure it. It's a very different kind of writing than for academic journals. And so most of us are not trained in writing, high level science, but not for subject matter experts in our very specific areas.
It reminds me, sorry, Justin, we'll just be quick. It reminds me of something I often start with when I talk to fellows about writing a grant. And I ask them, why do you write a grant? And immediately get the answer, well, to get money for your research. And my answer to that is, and what else? And I think the what else part is that it really helps you focus your area, think ahead of what you need to do, and have a plan so that when you do get the money to do the work, you can hit the ground running. You don't have to think about, what I'm going to do next. What do I need to do first? It's all laid out for you there in the grant. So the other thing it forces you to do is become really familiar with the literature. And so you don't waste time doing something that, oh, gee, if I just read those papers before, I would have known somebody did this already. So there are actually lots of reasons to write a grant. And even if it is rejected, it's helped you along the way, because it's helped you synthesize your thoughts. It's helped you understand the literature, and it's given you a plan to move forward. Justin, what did you want to say?
Oh, I was just going to kind of come back to I think a point that we talked about a little bit earlier about choosing a study section and kind of, again, making sure that you're choosing the right one. And Lillian just talked about kind of the way that you need to pitch your grant differently to make it kind of more attractive to different institutes, but you also would need to pitch it a little bit differently depending on which of the study sections it's going to as well, because they all have, and the exact same grant can be reviewed very differently at different study sections in terms of the kinds of kind of conceptual sorts of things they're looking for, the sorts of methodological things they're looking for. So again, kind of to Lillian's point about spending your time on it, the time is obviously about the writing and the idea generation and thinking about that, but also kind of doing your homework in terms of figuring out all of those parts of things, which we get very, very little training in. So I'll pause there, and I think there was a question in the chat.
Good question about how do you decide if someone should be a collaborator, your collaborator should be an MPI or co-investigator. There are a lot of considerations around that. Some are grantsmanship and some are to do with your career trajectory. So I would say that in terms of grantsmanship, if the person's expertise is absolutely critical to getting the grant done, and it's completely complementary to your own, then an MPI makes a lot of sense. If they're going to help with one part of the grant, but it's really not overseeing the entire grant, then a co-investigator role would be more appropriate. I want to hear from Lillian and Justin what they think.
Yeah, I've done an MPI plan, and it was truly exactly what you suggest. We were looking at evidence-based smoking cessation practices and drug abuse treatment. We were doing it from an employee perspective. I had the organizational psych background. I'd worked with these treatment centers. My collaborator knew everything about smoking. She was in public health, so she was an expert on evidence-based smoking. So it was a perfect fit, and it was clear that the work could not have been done by just me, and it could not have been done just by Jessica. And so I think you just kind of nailed it, in my opinion. Like, you have to convince the committee that the work truly couldn't be done unless you had both of these people as PIs.
And for career considerations, and then, sorry, I did it again, Justin, I cut you off. For career considerations, you're a junior investigator. You have to know whether your promotion criteria will accept an MPI at the same level as PI. That is true for Emory School of Medicine. I don't know about UGA or some of the other institutions, but because some institutions will favor being a single PI over an MPI. So you need to know that probably should not be the deciding factor here, but it's certainly something to consider.
The other thing I was just going to say was, so if you have a multi-PI plan, and that person is not a junior investigator or an early career investigator, you don't get the bump. So you only get, so Kathy had presented the kind of the pay lines, and there's a higher pay line if you're an early career investigator, basically to kind of get people into the system. And if you have a senior investigator, and even if you're an early career, that kind of goes away. So kind of you don't get that bump. But the benefit that you get from having the senior investigator kind of might outweigh, and I know that was my experience. My first grant was a multi-PI grant with a very senior investigator, and I know kind of for me, I got one, I wouldn't have been able to kind of do that specific project without her, but two, kind of how much she was able to kind of make the work better, but then also I think help with the actual kind of how the study section viewed us, I think kind of was worth way more than kind of me getting, a 4 points higher on the pay line. So that's just another kind of practical consideration too.
Really, that's a really good point. Another good question in the chat about what's the program officer's connection to the study section. So if the grants that would fall into the program officer's portfolio, should they be funded, are being considered in a particular study section, the program officer attends the meeting and sits in the back and listens. The good program officers will actually take notes, and they'll get a sense of what were the things that must be fixed in order for the grant to be funded. So if you go back to them and you say, I need advice on resubmission, if they've said it on the discussion, they can say, well, it's not going to be funded unless you can convince the reviewers of XYZ. Not all of them do that as well as others. It really depends on your program officer. But they do not participate in the study section at all. They're there merely to observe. and then provide feedback at the end. So once you get the scores from the study section, you don't go to the SRO for advice, you go to the program officer.
So yeah, and I was just going to add, so the program officer is works for the funding institute, the institute, right? So the program officer works for the National Cancer Institute or something like that. The SRO, who manages the study section, does not. They're kind of a representative of the Center for Scientific Review. So kind of the program officer, as Kathy said, will kind of sometimes attend the study section meetings, but not all, but not always necessarily, especially if the study section is not meeting. Well, now it's maybe a little easier for some of the virtual meetings, but so just kind of clarifying that. And then, getting a multi-PA grant would remove early career status from future R01s.
I didn't look into a study section meeting. I am so glad you asked that, because part 3 of this series, we told you part 2 is about the supporting documentation. In January, we are going to do a mock study section. You'll be able to see exactly how it works. There is also a video on the NIH website where you can watch an actual NIH study section. You cannot sit in on an actual study section. Those are confidential. And there's a huge emphasis on confidentiality of the review process. But those are 2 great ways, either to attend our mock study section or to, thank you, Justin. This is another good point, though, what Justin just put in the chat. But you can watch that video on the NIH site. But Justin, I will let you explain what you just put in the
Yeah, so I just put in kind of this program that NIH has called the Early Career Reviewer Program, where kind of you would just indicate your interest and so here kind of when the one kind of friends of mine who have done this and the one I was on when we had this, they would maybe be assigned like 2 grants to review versus kind of, I think, somewhere in 6 to 12 grants to review. So it's like much more manageable to do. And then they're kind of more of the point then is like you've reviewed these 2, but really it's more that you're getting to kind of sit in on the study section and see how people do it. And honestly, I think it was super, I think kind of being on a study section is super helpful for your own kind of grant writing. And so, do take, obviously like participate in part 3 that Kathy mentioned, watch the video, and then do look at the early career reviewer thing and whether that's something that you might kind of be interested in. I think it's worth just kind of putting your name down and kind of they'll eventually kind of contact you when you need it. Because I do think that experience, and at that point, I wasn't an early career reviewer, but when I was kind of reviewing grants, I just found it so helpful in terms of thinking about the things that like people do wrong so that you don't do them wrong. I mean, and then also the things people do right so you can do them as well.
I will absolutely agree with that. There is no better way to learn to write a grant than to serve on study section and see all the ways that you shouldn't write a grant and see all the ways where people do a really good job writing a grant. If you're already being added to your own institute's reviewer pool, probably not. Same month, I don't know that you can still participate in that program. Again, ask your program officer; they will know.
And Kathy, there was a comment before that.
Yeah. So qualifications and potential contributions of a postdoc. So you can include the bio sketch of the postdoc and outline their qualifications there. Also, when you're talking about your team, we talked about different places in the grant where you can talk about the expertise of your team. It's perfectly fine to pull in and describe there the expertise of a particular postdoc. All right, we have a few minutes left, so we'll stay and answer questions. Can you add a co-investigator after you get a grant, not without approval of the NIH? I will just quote Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done, which is true about grant writing. And we wish you the best of luck as you write your own grants. I would ask one more thing, which is, if you would, please, you'll get an evaluation survey. Gray put it in the chat earlier. We'll also send it out via email. We would really appreciate your feedback to see if this has been helpful to you, what we can do to improve it in the future. Are there other topics that you would like us to address in future offerings? feedback's really important to us. So if you would take a minute to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. We can stop sharing the slides, Lauren, but then the slides and the recording will be available to you after we're done. Lauren James, who I did not introduce in the beginning, but is our associate director of the part of the CTSA that put this on, will be the person who will be sending them to you. So any last questions before we close for the day? Justin, did you want to say something?
No, I just saw that you two were unmuted, so I thought I should join the party.
All right, well, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. We hope it's been helpful to you. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do to help you on this journey.
Thank you so much.